That's right.
But then when I go to the USB capture card, I have to set it to not mirror the image.
Yes, that's because Zoom is assuming you're using a mirrored thing like a selfie phone or whatever.
You're live, by the way.
And welcome, Michael Pemberton, to the Freeborn Podcast.
All right.
Welcome back.
Glad to be here. Maybe it'll be a little better this time. I was telling Linda,
you're too
I
hard
hope
on
we can do
yourself.
it so well that it obliterates the previous one in everybody's mind.
I don't know why you say that. I liked the first one.
It was boring.
It was boring to you? Really? I was very interested in the conversation.
Yeah.
And I don't ever look at the comments, so I don't know if anyone else thought it was interesting, but I was intrigued. I thought our conversation was very interesting.
Good. Well, I'm looking forward to today. As I said, I did no preparation for today at all. I have no idea where you're going with this interview, so take it away.
Well, Nolan's the only one then that knows where we're going. Where are we going with this interview?
Well, I kind of was just hoping you could be very clear on what you do at work.
This is the question.
This is like the one question everybody wants to know. What do you do at work?
This is what is on the mind of all three viewers.
Of all three viewers.
All three viewers.
What does this guy do for a living?
I have asked a number of people, and nobody knows what it is you do, what your job is exactly. So why don't you tell us what exactly it is you do?
Well, so if you looked up business architect online, if you go to LinkedIn, I would say look for a woman named Wendy Kuehne, Kuehne, Kuehne. I can never remember how she spells it. She does a set of videos and some podcasts about business architecture and the things that I do for a living. And she's one of the few people that I know who thinks like I do about these things, right? So if you really want to know what I do for a living, everything I do for a living could be described in fourth grade, right? I don't think my math skills went beyond fourth grade. And that was when they introduced set theory.
In fourth grade?
Yeah,
No, they didn't introduce set theory in fourth grade.
Oh, sure they did. They still do. They introduced set theory very early in elementary school these days.
What are you talking about?
Oh, absolutely. Right? They get those kids thinking in sets early.
They got kids graduating from high school that don't even know that 2 + 2 = 4.
Well, that doesn't mean they don't. That doesn't mean they learn it. That's a different thing.
Okay,
entirely.
so how do they introduce set theory in fourth grade?
Oh, they talk about apples and oranges. How many apples do you have? How many oranges do you have? And that is their initial attempt to introduce set theory. And it's very early on that they begin talking about this stuff because they're trying to get people to think this way. It seemed to really fit the way that I tend to think about things. So I look at everything in a matter of sets. So when I look at business, I think of business as a set of sets, a system in which there are sets and interactions between sets. So I tend to see large, long-running pictures, right? Most people have a sense of cause and effect in their mind, but as human beings, psychologically speaking, most people's understanding of cause, their temporal perception, we refer to it as temporal perception. Their temporal perception in the past is very short. And this is why things like fetishes arise, right? And superstitions among sports players, right? The last time we won the game, I was wearing this T-shirt. This is my lucky T-shirt. I'm not going to wash it again, but I'm going to wear it in every critical game from now on, right? And never mind the fact that their diet was actually different leading up to that game, and the other team had things going on in that game.
And they had washed the T-shirt the night before.
And they had washed the T-shirt the night before the last time, right? All of those things, right? Their temporal causality perception is very short. So the ability to perceive long-range causal loops is really challenging for people. I tend to think that way. And it's just an oddity of the way I think, but it works that way.
Real quick, is it kind of like when people get sick and they go, man, it must have been the burrito I just had for lunch?
Yes.
When it could have been 2 weeks ago?
But generally speaking, if you go out to eat and you get sick, it was probably something you ate 6 to 8 hours before you got sick. Maybe not the last meal you ate. Mm-hmm. It was when you didn't wash your hands before lunch. It wasn't what you ate for dinner. right? If you eat dinner at 6 o'clock and you get sick at 9 o'clock, it wasn't the 6 o'clock dinner that made you sick. It was something you did in the afternoon, right? But it's very hard for us to perceive that. We perceive the meal we just ate, right, as being the cause for our indigestion or our upset stomach right now, right? And that's just that way. So I tend to see it in larger systems, and I see it in sets. My theodicy was based on set theory, and it was based on predicate set theory. And I strip all that math out to do a public presentation of that theodicy. But my thinking through it was based on predicate theory. So that's what I do. But I say all those words because I've learned those words, and they make me sound smart. But in reality, it's fourth grade set theory. It hasn't gone much beyond that, right? So, but I also draw pictures. The other side of my career, or what I do at work, is my ability to convert complex thoughts into relatively simple pictures. And my art skills are not serious art skills, right? They're pretty basic. But it turns out that my less advanced art skills turn out to be an advantage for me because the pictures themselves are simpler, and the speed to production of those images is much faster.
Right.
Right. So it works out to my advantage. So I get invited to meetings where my only purpose in that meeting is to draw pictures on the graphic recorder.
And how common is that? So I know you do that, and I've seen you do it, and I'm just curious, are businesses all around doing that? Is that something that just a few businesses do? How common is that?
It's becoming more and more common. And as far as how common it is right now, I can say around the world right now, there's an international visual practitioners forum. The IVPF or whatever. And I am a member of that. Although I don't pay dues. I'm not a dues paying member. I'm
not a card carrying member.
I'm a free member right now. I'm a free member of it. Sorry, guys. And that's because the industry really is growing. And it's growing because more and more businesses realize a couple of salient points. First of all, they are terrible at PowerPoint, right? There's a book that, excuse the language, but the actual title of the book, there's a big Hoover vacuum on the front of the cover of the book. And the title of the book is Why Most PowerPoint Presentations Suck and What You Can Do About It.
Well, they're terrible.
They're terrible. They're absolutely terrible.
Yes.
Right? And no matter how many classes we teach executives on how to use PowerPoint right and how to use it wrong, how not to use it, they will still walk out and use it the way it's meant not to be used, right? Which is frames and bullets, bullet points, and lots of words on the slide. When the slide should be fewer words, more infographic feeling. But it turns out that when you're thinking at speed, if you aren't a person who naturally thinks in pictures and you're thinking at speed, it's very hard to get there. Complicating it further is the actual interface in something like PowerPoint to create new graphics that don't look like the same stale graphics that everybody's seen requires some skills. PowerPoint isn't there yet. If you pick up something like Adobe Illustrator or Inkscape, you've got a very powerful interface for creating those kind of graphics. But PowerPoint doesn't.
Yes.
And it's fraught with problems in there. And it'd be great if Microsoft one day listened to me and said, okay, Mike, we're actually going to implement some of the things you suggested, and we're going to change this and make it a little more usable interface. But it's not. It's a pain. But you can watch people online who will tell you this is how you build this kind of graphic. I've even produced a couple of videos myself on how to create those kind of graphics in PowerPoint. But it involves time, knowledge, and frustration that an executive doesn't have when you have this much time to produce a slide that's going to go through 4 iterations of revisions before it finally gets to where it's going. And I have this thing all the time. Like I very recently built a slide. Somebody said, we're building this, we have this complex decision process, and we need a simple way to convey it. And I said, okay, I'll build that for you. And I built it out sort of box and arrow-like, but very simple. And soon as the lawyers saw it, they said, well, that's just not right. You got this and this and this and this, and they added all this level of detail into the thing and created what I call an amalgamation, right? Created this amalgam of stuff nobody's ever going to read, because as soon as you look at it, you just feel like, if we can't make decisions like that, right? Nothing will ever get done. Nothing ever does get done, but
Yeah.
right. So after it went through that cycle, then it went up to the next level of management, and they said, this just isn't going to do. Go down and ask Mike to make us a simpler picture of this thing. So then I did. I made a simpler picture, and that's the one that went forward.
So how does what you do then replace like the PowerPoint presentation? So you don't use the PowerPoints at all? Is that how that works?
I do, because
No, I don't mean you. I mean in a meeting where you're graphic recording.
when in a meeting when I'm graphic recording, I do not use PowerPoint. I generally use 40 by 60 foam core and a set of markers, and I will capture that, convert it to SVG, clean it up, convert it to SVG, replace all my horrible handwritten font with really nice handwritten looking font. Right?
Yeah, right.
Do all that kind of stuff, so that what the customer gets back in the end is easy to read and can be reproduced at any size.
And what do they do with these drawings?
They use them for communication, especially for communicating what happened in a meeting. So, for instance, there's one business in town where, if you think about those 3 sheets, and you can lay them down like this next to each other, right? Tape down the seams, and then fold it makes a triangle, which you can then offset the next triangle on the top of and the next one on top of. So you make a pillar of this communication, and if the boards are labeled well, you can put a start here sign on the top of it, and you can follow it all the way around and down that column, and you can see the results of a meeting in which there was complex thinking happening. And you can see that thinking, the results of that thinking. You don't watch the whole process, but you see the results of that thinking, and its synthesis. It's synthesized together. Mm-hmm. The critical skill in it is the ability to synthesize what you're hearing. You're not recording what you're hearing. You're synthesizing it into a set of progressive images. And those don't have to be artistic, but they have to be understandable and telling. In fact, it's better if they're less artistic.
So how long have you been doing that?
I've been doing that now about 6 years. So when I started in industry back in the dark ages, right, which was like the early 90s.
Right.
We're going to go back that far. I got a degree in industrial engineering because it was the only engineering that concerned itself most with humans and people and what they did, which is my primary concern, not so much designing a machine as what people do. Mm-hmm. So kind of the human side of engineering a bit. And so I got a degree in industrial engineering and wound up through an odd set of circumstances really focusing on process, and which is the actual place where people do things in the system. And I spent the 90s doing process, and I taught process modeling and simulation. I wrote an advanced simulation course that I taught, and I taught it in places around the world, right? And I had a blast traveling the world in the 90s. That was the time to travel. As soon as 9/11 happened, travel became terrible after that point. And it hasn't improved since. But it was a blast back then. And I traveled the world with it, teaching process modeling and simulation. And that was basically a little bit of heavier math, but just introductory level statistics, not anything. We have reached a point where we've put all that intelligence in the software, right? If you have Microsoft Excel today, with some cheap add-on tools, you could analyze the data and it will tell you what kind of a distribution best describes that data, and then it'll produce that distribution for you, and you can sample from it and run. You don't really need to know that. I don't want to discourage anybody from learning statistics. I think you should. You need to know what it means, but the actual doing of it is buried in the software now. You don't really think about the stuff anymore. So I mean, that's all. That was the most I was doing then, and I was doing some very interesting simulations, very telling, and money saving in a lot of ways. But there was some there was a missing element from it, and I had an experience that, and this will tell you how stupid I am, right? How slow I really am. In the late 90s, in 98 and 99, I spent almost a year in Europe. And I would go for a year, or go for a week, and I'd come back for a week, and I'd go for a week and come back for a week.
Wow. It's a lot of air. That's a lot of travel.
It was a lot of airtime. I got a couple of good vacations out of all that travel, right? But, I told my clients, and the only way that I'm going to come over here for more than a week at a time is if you pay for my family to come. Because I'm not spending that much time away from my family. And so I had one client that did at one point. They said, yeah, bring your family. We need you here for 2 weeks straight, so bring your family. And it turned out not to be any more expensive to bring my whole family for 2 weeks than to bring me for a week and send me home again.
Right.
Right, and bring me back. So when I was there, I was building simulations, and a business simulation can have an animation that goes with it, right? Mm-hmm. All the simulation packages have some form of animation capability so that you can see the pieces of the business moving and you can see the counters clicking. And so I built a demo of one for a client. This was actually, I think I can share all this because it's been so long now. It was Barclays Bank in the UK, and they were doing a backfile scan. So they were scanning files that were very old and capturing them to image to get rid of all the paper in the system. That was their goal, get rid of all the paper in the system. Well, Barclays Bank has been around for a long time, and they have subsumed many banks that were around even longer. So they have actual real files from the late 18 and early 1900s that are still valid files. And at the time, for instance, they had a football team, a rural football team whose founder founded the team in the height of World War II and was still alive at the time, and whose signature still needed to be
By
validated.
football, you mean soccer?
Yes. Football team. I don't like either one of them, so it's fine with me. That's
I'm just clarifying because I was thinking football.
Football, no, yeah.
Okay, I got
Real
you.
football, the one you play with your feet only.
Football.
Football, right? So they needed all this captured, and they had. So when you capture one of those pages, that paper in World War II is very bad paper in the first place, right? And if you expose it to ultraviolet light just a little tiny bit, it almost turns to dust. So they had Agfa create a scanner for them where they could feed the paper in, and it would move the paper through the scanner on 2 layers of air, hold it above the glass, but with air coming up to hold it up against a white platen, and then with almost, you could barely see the light, and it was a very low red light that it would scan that with. And then you would verify that you'd captured the image, and it would come out and go into a shredder once you had that image. And so they wanted to know how long it would take them to complete their backfile scan. So I went through the whole system. I followed trucks. I counted warehouses. I followed the entire system through with a stopwatch, timed it, and built the simulation, and went with some of their estimates on how many actual documents they had. And we figured out it would take, at the rate that they were going, about 224 years to complete their backfile scan.
So what did they do to speed that up, or are they still working on it?
No, we sped it up considerably. So we created an algorithm that would determine the validity of a document earlier in the system, because what they were doing was they were scanning, then determining the validity and dumping images they didn't need. So we created an algorithm whereby they could determine at the warehouse with a camera, those pictures could be taken without hardly touching the document, it would resquare the document a little bit in software, right? So you'd open the file, take a picture, and then the software would square the image and upright it. They could determine without scanning it. It's low resolution, but it's enough resolution to let them know whether they to read the pertinent information on the document, determine whether it's needed or not, so they could do their sorting at the warehouse. And that instantly increased the number of sorters that they had for that information by like tenfold. Right? In the end, we got it down to just under 20 years to complete the background.
Oh, wow.
Which they thought was acceptable.
Well, it's better than 290 years.
224 years, right? It was.
So then going back, how does that get you into graphic recording?
So at the time that I was doing this, I'd set up this, and they were watching this whole process flow on the screen. That's how we got senior leadership to understand the complexity of what they were doing and why they were doing it wrong, what they needed to do to fix it, right? Is that you had an animation. It's like a movie unfolding and showing you how slow this system is. And then we have an animation that shows if we did it this way, what would actually happen with it. There's a salesman that I'm working with a company called Bank Tech. And this guy aggravated me terribly because, look, I'm not really a computer nerd. Compared to my wife, I'm a scientist. I'm a computer scientist, right? But I'm not really that much of a computer nerd. And this guy was even worse than my wife. I mean, this guy couldn't get anything right. So when I create the simulation in the software, I create the model, the process model, and export it to simulation, it comes out to the simulator as a set of ovals that he referred to as balls, right? Because in his mind, it's somewhere between a rugby ball and a football. It's between those two, so I don't know what to call it, right? So he just called them balls. And so he looked at it and he says, "Wow," he said, and he watches me produce one of these one time, and he said, "That's amazing. So can you make me one of those with like 4 balls and 5 balls and 6 balls and 8 balls?" And I said, it confused me because I was like, I can make a simulation of any process we want to model. What do you mean? Those are just an intermediate step. He goes, fine, can you make me those? And I was like, of what? Anything, I don't care. And I was like, it took me a while to understand what he's asking. He was asking me for a mock-up simulation raw without the animation on top. And then I finally argued with him for like a week. And I said, yes, I can make that, but it means nothing to anyone. The numbers are purely fictitious and they're meaningless. And he said, the numbers don't matter. I just want that. And I said, okay, fine. I'll make that for you. So it took me like 15 or 20 minutes, and I made him these things. And he goes, oh, I don't want them. I said, what do you mean you don't want them? He said, oh, keep them on your computer. And then he would go out to lunch, and he's sitting there talking with some CEO. Back then, this tells you how different the world is in different parts of it. Back then in the 90s, if you had a cell phone plan in the UK, your cell phone had an IR port on it. Mm-hmm. And your computer had an IR port on it.
Yeah, I remember that.
You could use your cell phone as a hotspot, a modem, essentially, for your computer. So, and I remember, like, my phone doesn't have and you had to pay, like thousands of dollars in the U.S. for a phone that had an IR port, and you had to pay extra for that service. But over there it was just part of your plan. So he'd be sitting there and he'd be talking with a CEO, and he'd be typing away on his computer. And what he's actually doing is during this conversation, he's trying to figure out where he can source images from. And then he sends me an email. And the email says something like, I need a 6-ball, use this for the thingy that moves, and use this image from their website for one, and put this thing on the truck that moves, and blah, make it a truck, and da-da-da-da, right? And give me 2 counters that, and so I'd make this absolutely silly, stupid, meaningless animation and send it to him. And at the end of lunch, he'd turn around and he'd say, he knew enough to know how to run it when I sent it, right? The simulation package I had actually would create it as an executable by itself, right? And he would turn around and hit the key and it would run. And he sold, that's why I was there for so long. He sold millions of pounds worth of these projects that in the end were meaningless. I would go in there and nobody knew why I was there. Most of the managers at the company I went to didn't really know what their CEO had had told them to provide, right? But I was there to build a simulation and animation, and it aggravated me, and I didn't understand, and it would just frustrate me. And so I would go in, and finally I would say, I need a meeting with CEO, and I'd go in and say, okay, what is it you want this of, right? And in the end, all he wanted, I was very insulting at the time. I used to think all they wanted was a way to prove a business case, whether it was right or not. But it turns out, it took me leaving that world for a little while to figure out that's not what they really wanted. What they really wanted was a way to communicate down through the ranks this very complex thought that they had in their head, this vision of the future that they had in their head, that they just couldn't get anyone else to see. And an animation would work if they could get it right. And instead of just learning that and saying, you know what, I need to switch my role in life and become an animator and learn how to animate for business, I was sure these people were stupid because I had the right answers. I had the math. I could prove it. And why didn't you want the right answer? I want the right answer. I want to be right. Right? It's a terrible personality flaw that I have, that I want to be right all the time.
As opposed to all those people that are fine being wrong.
Yeah,
I think that's a terrible flaw.
I think it's a terrible flaw, right? They're sure they're right, even though I can prove they're not.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
And they don't want the proof
No.
that they're wrong. They want proof that they're right even when they're not.
They have a whole platform dedicated to those people. It's called Facebook. Yeah. There we go. We've both been there.
We've been there.
We visited.
I'm an occasional visitor to that platform. I use it when I need to. So in this century now, moving into this century, I ended up at Nielsen Media Research, leading a group of business architects. I formed a group of business architects and led that group while I was there. And at the time, Nielsen had these very special modems that they have a patent on. And these modems cost about $250,000 to build one of them as they are. And they had 24 of them in-house and 20 of them at a backup facility. And they were worried about capacity. And so I offered to build a simulation of it. And I knew I would have to build an animation, so I animated it right off. And the point of the simulation was to test whether or not capacity was sufficient. And I was able to prove that they were over capacity by more than 50% already. They should stop building modems and they should shut some off. That was just an untenable case to make. They just didn't want to hear it. So in the end, I said, okay, well, we'll test it. What's the worst night to test it on? What's that night? But if we don't get this data on that night, so I went through this whole long rigmarole and finally convinced them to shut down. But they wouldn't shut down 50% of them. They agreed to turn off 3. Well, it processed without a challenge. And the evidence was incontrovertible.
So what's the deal with these modems?
The modems have the functionality of those modems can be entirely replaced with commercial off the shelf today, but at the time that was not the case, right? When they invented those things. So the modem exists. You've got the unit in a home, the measurement unit of whatever type that is, and it has a time in which it calls in, and the modem has dedicated channels, buses, on which to receive the download data from that. And there's a complex handshake to validate all the data as it passes back and forth, right? Which is all in software now. It doesn't need to be done in hardware. But they had invented those things back when that capability just simply didn't exist. So it's what they trust. It's worked for them for so long.
And this is so that they can know who's watching what on TV, right?
Yes. That's audience measurement.
And for the people in my audience, TV is something that You would have to tune in at the right time if you wanted to see a show.
Well, yeah, it used to be networks, audiometry, which is what that's referred to as the measurements of the audience behavior and preferences and all that kind of stuff. The audiometry is greatly advanced even in Nielsen. Nielsen has an entire fleet of statisticians who work for them, and they analyze
because they determine
demographic data.
They determine which shows are going to get money. Basically,
They don't actually determine that. All they do is they
their
provide.
data does, though.
What's that?
Their data does.
Their data is used for that. Their data is used for a lot of things, for advertising spend, for political analysis, for social research. Their data is used for a lot of things because it's so accurate. I mean, they will pick a geographic area, and even the selection, the boundary of that geography is very statistically determined, so that within that boundary, the variation about the mean is fairly narrow, and they can actually identify a family who is that mean in that geographic region, and then they target that particular family until they get them as an audience member, and they walk a very fine line because you don't want to pay them in such a way that you would sway them in any way. But you're going to come into their home and you're going to put holes in the walls and install equipment in their home, and you're occasionally going to need to come in to maintain that equipment. So you have to compensate them somewhat. So they walk this very fine line, and they're very good at walking it to keep everything completely honest, because their business is based on honesty. If there was ever any perception of anything being wrong with Nielsen's data, they'd be out of business, right? So they are very, very careful, and they're very good at getting it right. So when they tell you audience preference is moving toward this, they're right. It is moving toward.
How many people are they sampling at a time? What's their sample size for these ratings that they come up with?
I don't know what it is today. I know it's a very significant sample. And because of the way that they select that sample, it doesn't have to be as big as it would be if you were doing a completely random sample.
Well, here
because it's not a random sample.
Here's why I say this, because this ties into some stuff I've been interacting with lately. There's people who don't understand how these samplings work, how these polling things work. And so they'll look at a poll that gets published and they say, we interviewed 3,219 people.
Right.
And now we know America is going to vote this way, or America likes this type of butter. And then you look at an online poll, right, and it says, well, we had 700,000 people, and it says that the sampled poll is wrong. But the sample poll is actually more accurate, even though they've interviewed, magnitudes of people less than have voluntarily clicked on an online poll. Mm-hmm. So explain why that is, because Nielsen does not have one of these boxes in half of the houses of America.
Oh, no.
Or a quarter, or 10%, not even in 1%.
It's a very small sample size.
So what would you say it is, you think, their sample size?
Well, it's in the thousands.
Right.
But not in the tens of thousands.
So let's say 5,000.
Okay, let's say something like that. Although you must understand, I do not know anything about how their business works right now.
I understand
been too many years, decades.
But I understand what you're saying. I'm just saying that the way these polling work, whether it's Nielsen, whether it's Zogby, whether it's Rasmussen, they're all polling different things, but they're doing a very similar thing, right? Similar methodology.
Similar.
Yes. And they're all polling. I mean, if you see a poll that has one of those polls that has 5,000 people, that's a big sample size. Mm-hmm. So why is that more accurate than one with 100,000 on an online poll?
Okay. So let me translate this in my mind for a minute.
Okay.
Translate this down a little bit. When you're talking about understanding reality in numbers, no matter what that reality is, let's take it out of human beings for a minute and let's put it in the sense of bacteria in pond water.
Okay.
Okay, because I think that I think that's easier for people or anything
No, that's
dandelions
fine. I
in a
like it.
lawn.
Okay.
Okay, or in a field where you can't see it so clearly, right? You got a field of tall grass, and you want to know how many dandelions are there in that field, right? Well, you've got several approaches you could take to that. You could fly a drone inch by inch over that field and count all the dandelions in that field. And that would give you a fairly accurate count of the dandelions in that field, but it'll be instantaneous, right? It'll be at the instant you flew that over. Those are the ones that you could identify in that field. and so there's some inaccuracy in that count. And maybe I can take this. I need to do a couple of things in my mind to get this to where people can understand why there's accuracy and inaccuracy in this. Think of if I had a ruler that was 12 inches long with gradients down to the 32nd of an inch. And I were to measure this room with that ruler. Just, I want to know the area of the floor in this room. And assume that there was no extra space on either end of that ruler, right? So the 0 line was on one end and the 12-inch line was on the other. That way I could lay it end to end and there'd be no gap between it. So I would start over here and I would start measuring the floor. Well, every single time I take a measurement, I'm introducing an error. Every time I put a pencil mark, there's a little bit of error in that pencil mark. And every time I put the ruler down, there's a little bit of error in where I place the ruler. So as I measure an entire wall, I actually have a compound addition of errors along that wall. And that will be less accurate than if I took a tape measure and just held it out along the wall. By a long shot, less accurate, right? I may come out an inch or two shorter in a room this size, which is like a 20-foot wall.
That's right.
I may come out on an inch or two shorter with that little ruler moving across there. Although some people would look at it and say, yeah, but you measured so accurately down to the 32nd of an inch all along there. No, it's actually less accurate because I used this little teeny tiny ruler to do all that measuring, right?
That's right.
And it's even more accurate if I use something like a laser to measure that space across there, because I'm using something at a higher level, right? So measurement doesn't always work the way we think it would. You can often introduce error by measuring a really big sample size if that sample size contains errors in itself. So there are ways to take a large sample, like on the internet where there's 700,000 people who click on a link, and then do some math in order to filter out the bias in that and filter out the error in it. But it takes some effort, and it's not the same thing as saying it's a really big sample, so therefore it must represent something closer to reality. In fact, it probably doesn't represent something closer to reality. It's just a whole lot of little teeny tiny measures, and every one of those has some bias in it, and you haven't filtered it out. Now let's take it the other way. Let's say I take a small sample, but I'm careful in how I select that sample, right? So let's take that same field with the dandelions in it. And I want to know what the likelihood is of finding a dandelion in a square meter of that field. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, this field is this many square meters. So I'm going to pick at random, I'm going to number them, starting at one corner all the way down. Then I'm going to pick, say, 13 of them at random. I'm just going to roll a dice or spin a counter or whatever, generate random numbers. So I'm going to generate 13 random numbers, and I'm going to go out to the square meter in that field that is represented by that random number, and I'm going to very carefully count the number of dandelions in that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask myself a question. Do I have any reason to believe that there may be a higher density of dandelions on, say, one edge or another, or what? I have to ask some questions about the distribution for the population. And once I've arrived at a conclusion that says the distribution for this population is likely random, right? There isn't something that forces it to be unrandom in one area or another. Then my very small sample of 13 and that counting will give me a mean. Now, then I'm going to calculate the spread about the mean, called the confidence interval. And that confidence interval is going to give me a range of confidence in which I'm certain that I've actually captured the real mean. Right? So if I capture a mean, let's say that mean comes out to be 6 dandelion plants per square meter. And my 95% confidence interval would give me plus or minus, a plus or minus number, plus or minus 3.
Is that what polling calls the margin of error?
Margin of error is that confidence interval. And that margin of error gives me a plus or minus, right? Now, we make this assumption that if I measure enough of the population, I don't need a margin of error anymore, but that actually isn't true. You actually need a greater margin of error the larger your sample size gets. Sample sizing itself is an interesting science.
Yes.
And it requires you to actually make some assumptions or get some foundational knowledge about the population before you can. Now, it turns out that in any real population that's out there, chances are whatever you're measuring is normal. And by normal, I mean follows what's called a normal distribution. We call it that because it's normal for almost everything. It's the normal one you would use for almost everything. There's another version of that called a student distribution or T distribution, in which the tails are a little fatter and the curve is a little flatter. And you can often arrive at a student or T distribution when you are when you're messing around with when you're trying to do something with a normal distribution. It can become a student distribution. You push things out to the tail by denormalizing it a little bit, right? Mm-hmm. Flattening the curve, so to speak. And it becomes more of a T distribution. So when you're measuring a whole bunch of people online, you have to do a bias test to test for the bias of the people whose response you're getting. Now, let's assume we said we know there's a spectrum of both conservative and liberal, but how many of the likely voter conservatives and likely voter liberals are on this platform? And then we sought a sample size, an equal size sample from both likely liberal voters and likely conservative voters on that same platform. And we got that sample and it was 700,000. Now you have a valuable sample. It's a very large sample and it tells you a lot. But unless you've done that initial piece of bias filtering and sample and balancing, you don't know that what you got out of that was of any value to anybody at all. It could be completely non-valuable. In fact, historically, there were two famous political polls that were conducted exactly the same way in consecutive elections, and that is they were sampled by interviewing people in train stations. And the first one was dead accurate. The second one was dead wrong. And newspapers around the country published a headline that said Dewey wins because they were going off that poll.
Back in the Truman election.
That's right. Because they were going off that poll that had been so perfectly accurate in the previous election, but was no longer accurate because nobody checked the demographic bias in a train station. And it turned out that the demographics of train travelers had changed in that intervening period, and the train station sample was no longer a valid sample of the population. Nobody checked it.
This is the same thing that happened recently when everything has changed. We're talking about TV and Nielsen. Everything's changed about what people watch.
That's right.
There's a lot of people that don't watch TV anymore.
That's right. And Nielsen watches viewer habits as well as much as they watch viewership, right? So they check viewer habits very, very, very carefully. And that way they keep their sample very current.
Very interesting. So how did you get into doing all of this stuff?
Well, so I was a process engineer. And
I mean, before that, how did you get into go from where because you were in the Army, right?
Yeah, so I grew up on a farm in Michigan and realized very quickly. Now, a farm, by the way, when I say farm, when your dad says farm and I say farm,
We're talking about different farms.
we're talking about completely different concepts of farm, right? He would look at my farm and say, "That's a yard. That's a garden."
Yes.
Right?
Our we would plant 3 acres of sweet corn just for us.
Just for you.
Yes.
Right? We had less than an acre plowed up for a family of 8. And we grew corn, squash, beets, tomatoes, all that
Right.
sort of stuff. And that little, in where we were at in northern Michigan, that little garden plot more than fed our family. And we sold stuff until we got tired of selling, and then we just put it on the table and said, "Free, take it," right? Because we didn't want to work the stand anymore. And it grew a lot.
Isn't that cool in Michigan? You go there, and last time I went, it's been a while now. It's been several years, but they still had them. They would put their vegetables on the highway with a box where you put your money in.
That's right.
And nobody there to do it.
Nobody
You
there
just
to
walk
watch
up, pick your vegetables, and pay for them in the box.
And just walk away.
Yeah. And the box sits there with money on it all day, and they come at the end of the day.
They pick it up and walk away with it.
Yeah. It's a cool place to live.
It's very interesting, isn't
Yes.
it? Yeah. In fact, little story. This year we went up there for vacation, and we were there just at the end of cherry season. The cherry festival in Traverse City had ended, and we were driving out this little peninsula there in Traverse Bay. And I said, I really want some fresh cherries, right? So there's this one little stand there's a bunch of stands on that little peninsula, and there's one little stand. And Linda and I got out there, and when we went up, these 3 little girls, and they remind me of Megan's kids, right? They're all barefoot running across the gravel driveway, right? And they don't even notice the gravel, right? They're just run across, these 3 adorable little kids run across, and they got the dog in tow, right? And the dog is trying to keep up with the kids, right? Chasing the kids across. And they sat out there, "What can we get you?" It's just is, and it's just that way. It's like, it's a completely different world.
It is.
So yeah. And that's the way we were in it, right? But we knew that if we were there, we could actually, if we were sitting in the stand, we could sell more vegetables than if the stand were idle, right? And one of the things was you keep the vegetables dusted off, and people will buy them if they look cleaner, right?
Yeah.
Buy more of them. So, because they think, I need this many, but I want to eat some now. And it's clean, so I can, right?
Somebody should tell Mexico about that little trick, huh?
Clean the stuff?
Yeah, they're clean. There are vegetables and fruits that they have in the mercado.
It makes a huge difference in the number of them that you sell. I'm just telling you, okay? So we had a whole little routine for cleaning those things, too. But that's a whole nother story. But anyway, so I grew up on a farm. And when I was in my senior year in high school, I realized I wasn't going to make it on the farm. It was not going to be the life for me. And there was nothing in that town that I really wanted to do for a living. There was a place where they made masonite called Abitibi board. And I didn't want to work at the masonite plant. And there was an engineering firm, and at the time I had no interest in being an engineer. And other than that, there really wasn't much industry that I wanted to stay in that little tiny town for, right? As much as I liked living in that community, I just couldn't see myself there long term. And by the way, it was a very monochromatic community. And I kind of liked the idea of not living in such a monochromatic community. So I left there and I joined the Army. And I spent 4 years in the Army and got out thinking I was going to be a salesman. And I came to San Antonio because, of Eddie Kincaid. And I had met Lyndall. And I had gotten saved when I was in the Army. Long story. And so I came to San Antonio, and I met Eddie's sister, Linda, and married her. Best decision of my life. And everybody acknowledges that. And tried to be a salesman and failed at it. Absolutely.
What were you trying to sell?
I tried to sell everything. I tried to sell pest control. I tried to sell automobiles. I tried to sell T-shirts. I don't know. I tried to sell vacuums at one point. I tried to sell everything that I could.
Just not made to be a salesman.
I'm just not made to be a salesman. Because when I'm sitting across from this person and I'm thinking, you know what? Here's what I want to tell you. Here's what you really need. You need to get your life in order. And you need to get right with the Lord. You don't need this new car. this is just a patch over a problem you've got in your soul right now. You need to fix that problem. Then come back to me and we'll talk about a new car. Right. And so I was an absolutely lousy salesman. I just couldn't do it right. I could not be a decent salesman. And then I got really discouraged because I didn't know what I wanted to do in life. And so I ended up digging ditches for CPS for a couple of years. And then Linda got pregnant. And I said, okay, I cannot play at life anymore. I got to get serious about this. And so I sat down with a college catalog, and I still couldn't decide what I wanted to do. And back then it was a paper catalog, right? It wasn't online. There was no online back then. And I ripped out of the college catalog all the things I didn't want to do, like mortuary science, right? That's not for me. And food science and prep. I'm not working in the kitchen. I already did that at McDonald's. I'm not going to do that twice in life, you know. And I tore all that stuff out. And then I sat down with what was left, flipped the pages open, and industrial engineering technology. Okay, that's what we're going to do. That was it. Never looked back. I came up with a decision process. I followed it, and then I stuck with whatever the result was. And whether it was right or wrong, I didn't care. It was what I was going to do, right? And so I got my associate's degree through SAC. Great college. One of the greatest colleges in the world, by the way, as far as community colleges. San Antonio College is it is a resource in San Antonio. Now I'm gonna plug an alma mater here for a minute, but it's a resource in San Antonio. People don't realize the power of that resource, right? But San Antonio College is one of the largest community colleges in the world, and its credits are recognized at more universities in the United States than almost any community college anywhere. When I transferred to what is now Colorado State, CSU Pueblo, Colorado State University Pueblo, but at the time was University of Southern Colorado. When I transferred there, all of my credits transferred. Nothing was discounted. So it is a real asset to this community. And so I got my associate's degree and figured out I wasn't going to get the kind of job that I wanted for my family with that degree, and decided I needed to go to university, and looked around, and I selected the one I selected. And the USAA had an office there, and Linda worked for USAA, and they transferred us there. And I ended up being an industrial engineer. So that's how I came into this. Long story, right?
Yeah. So how old were you when you quit digging ditches and went to college? Did you go to college part-time or full-time?
I went to college full-time. I mean, I worked part-time, but I went to college full-time.
Where were you working part-time?
I didn't when I was in San Antonio. Yeah, no, I did. I worked as a temporary laborer, and I couldn't do temporary office work because you couldn't type 20 words a minute. That was a skill you actually had to have back then.
Back then.
They don't even test for that now, right?
They don't?
No, why would you test somebody for typing skills now? Everybody uses a keyboard.
Right.
And keyboards are part of life. They're background noise. Now,
yeah.
It was
should definitely test me if I ever try to get a job.
Yeah, you could benefit from Mavis Beacon teaches typing.
If you test me on my keyboard on my phone, I would do pretty
Oh yeah,
well.
thousands of words a minute, right? Yeah, no. So yeah, I couldn't do office work. Plus, I'm a little bit, I have a learning disability, and simple things like alphabetizing things take me a couple whacks to get it right. First time through on the test, I'm probably going to get it
That
right.
reminds me of someone else.
In order for me to alphabetize, I actually have to run the alphabet in my head.
That reminds me of someone else.
See, I don't blame myself at all on this.
don't
I'm
blame
not at fault. I blame, mostly my parents who were in charge of me at the time. I was supposed to learn it. And then I went to Mexico at the time. And I think that's the year I kicked my teacher out of the classroom for being lousy.
Okay, so is anybody else here? I just want to know if anybody else in the audience is hearing. Because that's what I'm hearing.
Oh, no, I hear it all day, every day.
All right, that's what I was hearing too. Like, you're an adult now. Enough of that nonsense, right? Take responsibility for yourself. If you want to learn something,
Nah, I don't
learn
wanna
it.
do that.
Yeah.
It's a lot easier when you just blame other people.
But it's a lot easier to blame other people, right? You fit right in with your generation. Trust me. They're burning down cities all over the country right now with that same kind of logic. Yeah, I think you need to change it.
Those are my peeps. I got to stick with them.
Yeah, you're right there with them. Yeah. Yeah. So I was like 27.
27 when you started college.
When I started college, right?
And then was it 4 years or did it take you a little longer?
5 years.
Took you 5 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you got your bachelor's.
Got my bachelor's. Yep. But it was a large degree at the time, right? It had more credit hours in it than the average degree did. And I probably slowed it down a couple of times, right? Yeah, I got upset with some teachers along the way too, especially college professors. But then I got my degree in industrial engineering. And while I was getting that degree in Colorado, I worked at an antiquarian bookshop. Which
Your
was,
dream come true. I'm surprised you didn't just do that.
Oh,
They didn't have a college credit for antiquarian books.
Antiquarian books, no. Antique booksellers degree program, no, they did not. But I learned a lot about the business. The guy who owned the couple who owned the business, some of my favorite people in the world, and he became a dear friend to me. He since passed away of MS. He had been himself a power broker in real estate when he discovered he had MS and opened the bookstore in order to slow down his life and reduce his stress considerably. And one day he realized he couldn't do it very well by himself, and so he put a mark on the door case. And he said, the next person who walks in who's taller than that mark, I'm going to offer them a job. And at the time, I was working night shift.
Why taller than the mark?
That was just John's way. He was just that way. He needed a way to make a decision. And he put a mark on the door to make.
That's heightism. That's heightism. Right. I want that bookstore banned.
Right. Well, they're out of business now.
Short lives matter. Short lives matter.
Short lives matter. Wait. That doesn't mean your life is short. There used to be this song on the radio called "Short People Got Nobody" or something like that. You have to look that up on the internet.
Short people got no body.
It was a whole song about short people, and it was not a complimentary song.
Not PC, was it?
It was not PC. And I was working night auditor at a hotel, and it was just killing me because I was going to school during the day and night auditing at a hotel at night. Man, I was wearing myself out. And so I was like depressed and discouraged, and I eat, that's what we all do, right? We have that relationship with food. Right next to this bookstore was the most marvelous bakery I've ever known in my entire life. It was a German Jewish bakery called Kohlhaus's, and they would, every Friday, they made chocolate chip cookies, and the whole neighborhood would smell like chocolate chip cookies. It was absolutely cruel treatment for everybody in the neighborhood. And so I went in, got a chocolate chip cookie, and then I'm wondering, what am I going to do with this chocolate chip cookie and this cup of coffee? I'm still not feeling good about myself. So I went into the bookstore and walked in, and John said, "Hey, you want a job?" And I said, "What?" "Yeah, I want a job. I don't know anything about selling books." He goes, "You'll learn. You'll make mistakes, but you'll learn." And I was like, "I like this guy." Okay. So yeah, quit working in the hotel and went to work at the bookstore. And then, that's the one I told you where I actually had this little system where I could count up the books I wanted and take it out of my pay.
So you weren't making any money.
Yeah, I wasn't exactly paying to work there, but I wasn't taking home what I wanted to either, So it was terrible. But you can see the results in my home now.
Yes.
Right? I have some incredible old books in my home. Still friends with John's wife. And that's the job I had. And I had that job for almost 2 years after I got out of college because I just could not find a job in industrial engineering in Colorado Springs in that interim period. But I had a lot of great customers that I had come to know, really well at the bookstore. And one day there was this guy he's a historian, and he's a really real polymath. And we had talked over history, and several times, he was educating me on how history is really understood and how we really know whether something happened or didn't happen in history, how we make that judgment call, and which wasn't the way I thought at the time. And and I very naively believed that, if it was in a book, it happened, right?
George Washington couldn't tell a lie.
Right. Yeah. All that kind of stuff. Right. so it took him a while to educate me out of that. Well, he walked and he was gone for long periods of time. He lived in town and he was a mountain man and he did all this other stuff. And he came in one day and he said, "What are you still doing working here? Didn't you finally graduate?" I said, "Yeah, I finally graduated. It's been a while now." And he's, "Where's your resume?" And, when you're looking for a job, you carry that thing everywhere. So I pulled it out and handed it to him, and he read it over and made a couple of notes on it. He said, "Make these changes. Call this number. Ask for Mike. Tell him I sent you." And I did. And so I called and asked for Mike, and Mike said, "Oh, well, if he recommended you, then you need to get in here. I need to interview you." And I said, "Okay." So I went in and got that job, and that job was consulting for a company that provided consulting services to DoD, and I got on a project doing some very interesting process modeling for U.S. Space Command at the time. They said, "We don't know how our system works. We know how the book says it works, and we send people out to try to acquire SATCOM, satellite communication, the way the book says to do it, and we figured out it doesn't work that way. But all these commanders are getting SATCOM when they need it. So we want to be smart about this. So here's what we'd like you to do. We'd like you to go out and find out how it's really done, and then we'll update the manual to match how it really works," right? Which I thought was brilliancy in
Sure.
DoD. DoD isn't usually that smart, right? But Space Command, I mean, they're pretty smart people over there. So we went out there, and I was on this thing with this guy who's still one of my good friends in life. He was a black man, and by black man I don't mean like light brown. I mean deeply black man from a really bad part of St. Louis called Platoon, and he was very soft spoken, Lou Rawls kind of voice. I used to tease him and tell him, "Jake, the next time you have to do a presentation, I'm going to have a volume knob installed in your neck. I'm going to turn it up and break it off," right? Because he'd start out the presentation really loud, and it didn't take him very long before he'd fall into that soft little voice that he had, right? Which is, I think, great for romance, but not great for public speaking. Right? He's so incredibly smart, right? And him and I traveled. His first one I traveled the world with. He taught me everything about how to travel, right? And for instance, we went to Panama, and we were in Panama, and they had us under military guard in this hotel in Panama. And Jake goes, "You need to learn how to do this now." And I said, "Okay, teach me how to do it." So we stood at the window and we watched all the people on the street. And he said, "Okay, do you see how they dress?" "Yeah." "Do you see how they conduct themselves?" "Yeah." He said, "Pick out whatever you have in your suitcase that looks close to what they're wearing. And when we walk outside, don't look stupid. Don't look around at all the buildings and admire the art. Look like one of them when we walk out. Act like one of them when we walk out of here." And I said, "Okay." So we went out the back door where the military guys, the MPs weren't sitting. They're sitting in the lobby, and we went out the back door. And we went out on the street, and Jake had gotten directions to a restaurant, and we walked down the street and found this great restaurant. And unfortunately, they didn't actually want to let us in because we were dressed like people on the street, which was like Bermuda shorts and a T-shirt kind of thing, right? And it turns out this was a upscale restaurant, seafood restaurant. But we convinced them it was our last night in town, and we really wanted to try the seafood in Panama, and so they asked us to wait in the coat closet, which was actually a fairly good sized room. And while they put a potted plant in front of this little alcove, and then they seated us behind this potted plant in this alcove. And I had the greatest lobster thermidor I've ever had in my life right there in Panama. People in Panama are absolutely wonderful people.
Never been there.
And I have found, I followed Jake's method every place I've been in the world since then. And I have found that I have never been in a country. I've been in South Africa when they advised me, "Don't leave your hotel," and I did exactly the same thing there. I watched the people on the street, then I dressed accordingly, and I went out and behaved myself like them. And I went all over the place, and nobody even notices you when you do that, right? But you're not acting like a jerk, and you're not, you're just acting like a people, right? A person, right? And I bought lots of exotic biltong which is the original of what we think is beef jerky, right?
Right.
Only it's the real thing, right? Called biltong.
What is it?
It is a cold processed, cold dried meat. And the way it's typically
Like
done.
beef or what?
Oh, all sorts of things.
Okay.
Springbok, beef, every kind of animal that's edible in South Africa, you can get as biltong. And it's usually done in an attic space in the wintertime. And so they do the fall slaughter, and then they string it up in the attic because it's going to be very, very, very dry and cold in the wintertime. And that meat dries out without cooking in cold air. I liken it closer to freeze drying, only it's not that dry, right? And it's still meat, and it's biltong is amazing. And I got springbok, and I'm sure I ate biltong from some endangered creatures. I don't know what. All I remember is there's this big biltong stand and out on the street, and I'm like, I want them. Oh, just give me a piece or two of every one of them, and it cost me $80, and I don't care. I want all of that. And it turns out you have to eat it all before you leave South Africa. You can't.
They won't let you take it.
They don't want you to pack that in your suitcase, right? So yeah.
Is it salted?
No.
So it's just natural meat. There's no
It's natural. No, some of it is spiced, right? Like, but I think you can look it up online and find their method for making it. Some of it is peppered, things like that, but it's really good. And I probably ate 5 pounds of it, right? I was traveling with some of the guys. We went out on a little safari for some of the guys from South Africa while I was there. I was there on business. And so they said, we got to take you on this little safari while we're out here. And so I'm out traveling. There it is, biltong, biltong, biltong.
There it is. Nolan pulled it up.
Yeah. And so you can see it's got pepper on it. I think that's probably one of the most common ones. But you can see it looks like the way you cook beef, right? It doesn't look like jerky, which looks brown all the way through. Mm-hmm. It still looks pink in the middle. And it's more
well,
tender.
if you buy like jerky that's not thin,
yeah.
If you buy the thick jerky, it'll look like that.
It'll look a little more like
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that stuff is not as hard as jerky is. And you see that piece there. I know the audience can't see that picture, and that's okay. And you'll see a piece there with the fat on it still, right? And so when we went on that safari, they stopped and they said, we got to get some biltong for the day. And I was like, yeah, we got to get some more biltong for the day. So we stopped at this little thing. And I'm standing there looking at it, and I'm thinking, I wonder what I want. And the guy goes, I'll pick it out for you. Don't worry, right? So he picks it out. And I'm going through, and I'm pulling that fat off the meat and eating the meat, right? And he goes, what, you object to white meat? They refer to that fat strip as white meat, right?
That's white meat?
White meat, yeah.
What, you're going to try to buy biltong?
I want to see what you got.
See if you
Nolan's
can
looking up in Amazon for biltong.
I don't know if you can find it on Amazon. I don't know that they sell it, but there are some places online where you can find biltong today in the U.S.
There they are.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, who knows if they're.
I don't know how good that is.
The ones from Africa directly.
Yeah, if you
There
can.
you go. Jack links right here.
Yeah, there you go. They got it at HEB.
Yeah, I can tell you right now that the Springbok biltong is my favorite.
What is Springbok?
Springbok is a small deer in Africa. Small little deer-like animal, and it's sweet. It's amazing. It's
And do a lot of people eat that? Is that very common to eat?
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's very common.
Is it like sold all over the place, or
It's sold all over the place, made all over the place, and it's like the guests who come to your house, it's sort of like where all your mates' biltong is right in their house, right? And so, and if you're going to go visit your mate, you're going to drink beer and eat a biltong, I mean, it's just the way they...
I think Monterey does that.
what's that?
Monterey, that kind of a dried beef.
Well, theirs is called machacado.
Yes.
That's very different. So that's like real thin and like shredded almost like a shredded dry meat, carne machacada.
Yeah.
That's what they have in Mexico. That's the Mexican version of beef jerky.
And South Africans love their biltong and their rooibos tea. Those two things.
What is rooibos tea?
Rooibos is a tea made from a bush that like if you were to go and ask what is that bush, they would say, well, that's called a red bush. And rooibos, somehow red is in the name of that. I think it actually means red bush, right? Rooibos, and it's a naturally caffeine free tea, but it's got a very unique and robust flavor to it. But it's not spice, kind of thing. Rooibos.
Do you like it?
I love rooibos tea. Yeah, I really like it a lot. I liked all the food that I had in South Africa, and I ate some stuff. I have no idea what it was because I was walking down the street following the crowd, and I found myself standing in a queue, and I was like, I wonder what this is about. And I figured I'd just stay in line where I was and figure out what it was in the end when I got up there, right? I was hoping it wasn't something disgusting. But when I got up there, it was this little food stand. And this woman who was working this spoke very little English, some, right? Because everybody in South Africa speaks some English. But she, I think, was more tribal. And she was selling something that she would put together as you ordered it, and I just was listening to the people, and so I just said whatever they said, and so I got this little paper cone, and it had some vegetable things and some meat things, and I have no idea what it was, and it had spices on it, and it was cooked, and I walked around eating the thing, and it was delicious, and I still don't know what that thing was, and I don't care. I have never gotten sick eating food on the street. I've got sick drinking water, eating raw vegetables in a country, but I have never gotten sick. The people who are cooking food on the street it's well-cooked food, and it's most of my favorite food around the world is what I get from street vendors,
yes,
wherever I go in the world.
I've only gotten sick because I ate an opened coconut off the side of a road in Mexico.
And by on the side of the road, he means on the road.
On the road. No, it wasn't a stand. It was just a coconut that I thought would probably taste pretty good. So I picked that up.
So I want you to go back to the I didn't learn my alphabet very well conversation a few minutes ago and ask really who's at fault here.
He's blaming that one on his parents too.
That one on them too. They thought it was okay when I picked it up and ate it.
I spent some time with your dad. He blames everything on his parents too. So you're right in line. He blames his, I don't know. So yeah. But
it's machacado.
It's carne machacada.
Yeah.
I thought maybe because they look different. I guess they shred it when they're done with it, drying it.
Yeah,
it's like so dry it just
crumbles.
Yeah, it just shreds, and they put it in eggs. That's a very typical Mexican meal is eggs with carne machacada.
Have you had that cabrito asado? Do you know what that is?
That's goat meat.
Yeah.
Young goat, cabrito.
Have I had that?
I don't know.
I love cabrito.
I don't know. Was it on the side of the road?
Could have been.
No,
I ate it. I ate street food in Mexico every single day of my life.
Yeah.
Every day of my life. Never got sick down there.
No.
Never did.
No, man.
Well, see, they'd always say, well, if you eat that food, you'll get sick. And I'm like, well, there's 50 people eating that food.
Right.
I mean, why aren't they all getting sick?
Right.
That was my reasoning. So I'm like, well, if the whole neighborhood's standing there eating food, now if the taco man is skinny and everyone standing there is emaciated, don't eat that food. You need to find where the taco man's fat and all the customers are fat, and then you're like, okay, they're repeat customers. They've been there before many times.
So let me tell you what I know. I know that when people blame it on the food, it's most often not the street food. It's the fact that they ate street food and they'd been handling all sorts of things, and they didn't wash their hands, and they weren't paying attention to keeping the separation between their hands and the food, the paper that it's served on, and that's a completely different issue. That's just because you're gross and you don't know how to wash your hands before you eat, and we're still, I like that meme on Facebook that said, when I was a kid, we believed by the year 2000 we would have flying cars. Here we are in 2020 teaching people how to wash their hands, and yeah, that is the world we're living in. Yes,
Yeah.
we're still trying to teach people how to do that.
Well, in Mexico, when we first moved down there, they didn't have plastic bags and stuff like that. Still, it was very uncommon. Everything was served in unrecyclable but reusable containers. So like
Right.
glass.
Right.
You had to pay like the gold glass Coke bottles. You have a deposit on that kind of stuff. Everything was. Oil was still in cans.
Yes.
Right. And so that's how Mexico was. And so you'd go to the street food and they'd give you a plate, and you'd eat off of it, and then they take it and they just take the rag they've been using, and they just wipe it off, put more tacos, and hand it to the next guy. That was the was how they serve food.
Now, I know there's a lot of people in America who are going to say that's just awful, but that's just because you don't remember a Baptist dinner on the grounds in the 1950s. That's the way that thing was run, I guarantee you.
Well, you don't remember the common
Cup.
that was at the drinking fountain where you would all just reach in and everyone would share. That's why they had herd immunity back then. It's also why they had a short lifespan.
That's also why some people had more than one spouse, not at the same time. They buried a lot of them.
Yeah.
And kids and all that.
Yeah.
Right. We've learned a lot since then.
Now, then shortly after that, when I was in Mexico, then they started taking and they got plastic bags, and that was great. And it was at the same time was a disaster.
Yeah.
Right. Because now there's plastic bags all over the country. It's just
Littered all over the ground.
littered everywhere. Which I don't. It looks terrible, but as far as I'm concerned, it saved enormous amounts of life. So,
Yeah.
I know people think the Earth cares. The Earth doesn't care. The Earth doesn't care one bit about it. But the number of people whose lives were made better by plastic bags in Mexico is enormous. Enormous.
Yeah.
And both in health, economics.
If you ever want to read a really good book on it, look up the book "Saving the Earth Through Pesticides and Plastics." It's a very interesting read.
And so it's a pro-pesticide approach perspective, or
Yeah.
what is it?
Yeah. Saving the Earth through pesticides.
Because that was what I had my dad on the podcast, and he's a big proponent of pesticides as a general rule,
Well,
and what the advantages they bring.
so I understand both sides of the argument. I've been on both sides of the argument myself before, right? I've held both opinions. The truth is, a lot of what we consider organic now is not possible without pesticides. And what I mean by that is, it is possible for you, right here on this ground in Texas, to plow up a piece of your backyard and grow organic, although I hate that term, right? I think we need to find things that mean something. Can you be an organic chemist? And that's not the same thing as organic broccoli. And you're an organic life form, and so is bioengineered corn. And so calling something organic is simply
It's
confusing
propaganda.
people. It is propaganda. But you could grow organic corn and beets and squash in your backyard and be successful at it. But the reason is because all these farms around you are using pesticides that reduce the population of pests in this area so that your organic has a chance of surviving in this climate, right? Which is very different than it was in, say, the 20s and the 30s before we had those kind of
That's
chemical
exactly
assistance. Right. When the population of those bugs could reach an indefensible level in a particular year.
It's like the guy who gets in your car, rides to the beach with you, and then brags about how you don't need a car to get to the beach.
Right. Right. It's like the people who drive an electric car and brag about saving the environment. Right. And they don't think about how many pieces of that car were put on a truck and taken to a factory, were dug out by huge pieces of earth-moving equipment because the metals used in the battery are not easy to find. They are rare earth metals, and they're called that for a reason.
Yeah.
and the absolute expense that went into the production of that vehicle, much of which is offered to them below market rate because it's subsidized, and they're not realizing the actual impact and cost of the technology that they happen to have right now. And they can drive this electric car and rail against technology companies at the same time, which is,
This is interesting because, although this is a strange segue maybe, but this is actually the parallel thought that I have been considering now for a while in my thinking and discussion on Bible translations, which is odd, which is that conservative fundamentalists like ourselves often have the idea that nobody needs to know Greek to understand the Bible. And while I understand the point they're trying to make, many of them, I think, take it to an inaccurate extreme, right? In that since the Bible was written in Greek, at some point someone had to know Greek to understand the Bible. And we are now beneficiaries of people who knew it well enough to translate it and give it to us. And now we want to pretend that wasn't necessary. We want to pretend that none of the like in the example, how I've been looking at it as in parallel is like, for instance, in that you have this electric car and you're like, I don't need gasoline. I can live my life without fossil fuels, provided I have this enormous industry built on fossil fuels, giving me something by which I don't need fossil fuels. So I get to go around with the bragging rights that I live my life fossil fuel free.
Right.
It's like
my carbon footprint is reduced.
I have a zero carbon footprint because I'm not counting all of that goes into giving me the zero carbon footprint life I have.
That's right.
And it's the same thing with this. I find it very similar. It's like, well, I can look down on the idea of knowing Greek because I had 300 people in the past who really put a lot of effort into it and gave me a translation by which accurate enough that now I can say, I can look, not that I personally don't need Greek, because I can look down on the whole concept of it and pretend that's foolishness.
Right. And I see and understand, again, both sides of that argument, right? Just like the pesticide argument, I've seen the overuse of pesticides and the negative impact that the overuse of pesticides has. And most farmers of any intelligence would never overuse pesticides. They know what happens when they do, right? You don't want to eliminate all the pests. It's a very bad thing to do. It's like saying, let's hunt down all the sharks in the ocean and eliminate all the sharks. That would be a very, very bad idea, right? Now, that doesn't mean that that we want a lot of people getting eaten by sharks at the shore, right? But those are two different issues. And you don't want to use so much pesticide that you eliminate all pests, because you eliminate too many good things in the process. And it turns out that those pests are more beneficial often than what we think they are. So you want a balance of that, right? And guarantee there's occasionally a dumb farmer out there, but you never really, if you think farmers are stupid, then you've never really met any farmers, right? Because they're very, very far from dumb.
Correct.
They're very careful. They care very much about the environment, right? Because their life is bound up in the environment and the climate. They do not want to damage that land. They want to protect it. They are very careful about the weeds that they kill and the ones they don't. I mean, they balance all that carefully, right? And so people who publicize it as though, you've got these industrial type farms just destroying the land, they don't know what they're talking about. And same thing biblically. And I liken it to this. I say that if you give me a really good knife and a compass, I think I could survive almost anywhere in the world. I could probably make my way. But do you understand how big those ifs are? You understand what you mean by a really good knife? You mean somebody who had this deep knowledge of metallurgy from generations of learning how to forge steel. It's not the same as somebody prehistoric being dropped in the middle of somewhere and having to survive. That's a completely different challenge for them than it is somebody with a good steel knife and a compass, right? So those are completely different issues. And when it's man against wild and you've got a knife and you've got a compass and a sense of where you're dropped in at and a sense of where you need to go to, that's completely different than being a stranger in a wilderness someplace. So, and I'm not trying to denigrate things like that program. I'm just saying there's a difference there. And many Christians fail to see that difference as well. So if I were to say all you need is faith, the faith of God in your heart and the word of God in your hand, and you can do any work that God calls you to do, I absolutely do mean that, right? If you had the King James Bible in your hand and you trusted in God in your heart, and you went forward with the knowledge you got out of that book, you could have good, pure doctrine, and you could do any work you wanted to for the Lord. Now, that is not the same thing at all as saying all anybody ever needs is the King James Bible. That's a completely different...
Yes.
You understand? Those are two different statements. And there's a difference between the knowledge that's obtainable and the knowledge that I need at any given time. And I grant easily, in fact, I readily grant that it's very challenging for church leaders, because what you want to do is you want to give the people sitting in that seat out there who are facing bills, children who are wandering from the Lord, stresses at work that are just phenomenal, problems with their family and cars that are breaking down and all the things that go into life. And you want to give them something so that you're not trying to give them something they can hold on to. You're not trying to give them something to get them through. You're trying to give them something that they can grow on, right? And so to take somebody who just got saved yesterday and they're 50 years old and tell them, great, now you need to learn Hebrew and Greek before you can understand the Bible, well, that just doesn't seem like very good pastoring, right? It just doesn't seem very good for that.
Correct.
But being able to say, I'm going to give you the Bible in your hand and you can trust this book. The one I'm handing you, trust it and live by it. Now you've given us something they can grow on. So saying that I can give you a book that you can hold in your hand, that you can trust, you can bet your soul on and trust in your whole life, is not the same as saying that's all anyone ever needs. Those are two different statements. Because I think in order to I don't want to overstate the case in either direction, and I think it's easy to overstate it.
Yes.
Because some people would say, well, in order to truly understand the Bible, you need Greek and Hebrew. And I would say, well, I don't know that that's the case either, because it depends on what you mean by truly understand. And that's hard for people, right? Because I know people who know Greek and Hebrew, and when I say something like, tell me what the basic gist of the book of Ephesians is all about. Why did he write it? What's he trying to say? Give it to me in 3 sentences or less. They can't.
Correct.
Right? Even though they know Greek and Hebrew, they can't just give me that, right? Because their hermeneutics are weak and they just have never looked at it that way. I could land them in a passage somewhere in the New Testament, just the New Testament alone, and say, here's this passage. You've quoted this verse before. Yes. Okay, good. Tell me what argument it's a part of. And why is he making that argument? They can't give me that, right?
No, I agree.
And they're Greek and Hebrew. So I don't think it's that you need Greek and Hebrew in order to understand.
I agree. But that is only looking at it from a very personal perspective.
That is. I agree with you.
Because if it hadn't been translated...
I agree with you
right,
entirely.
That's my point. My point isn't that I think that every person or even every pastor needs to know Greek and Hebrew to understand the Bible. Not at all. Rather, that we now are able to understand the Bible.
Because
reading it in our language because people knew it and translated it in a very robust translation.
Yes.
Very well done translation.
Yes.
And
I agree.
I'm very confident in the translations we have.
I agree.
think the translations we have, particularly the King James translation,
Yes.
is a very good translation. I'm very amazed at the quality of that translation in everywhere. And I'm not an expert in Greek, but I know a lot about translation.
Right.
From
I'm
other
also, by the
languages.
way, I'm very impressed with one of the things that impresses me about this translation is that it set the standard for all translations to follow in the method of translation methodology, right? There just wasn't anything before it that was translated.
I think it was the first committee tranlation,
It's the
wasn't
first
it?
committee translation work, right?
Yeah.
And as a committee, there were a lot of mistakes they could have made in the way they did it as a committee, but they didn't make those mistakes. They actually set a very high bar for themselves as a committee. And everybody who has done a decent translation since then has been forced to admit that they're really building on the work that those men laid down when they set that committee forward. And they've often modeled their committee structures and their committee work on the work of the King James. But when we say that, you understand that when we say that, we're saying, therefore, their product could be of the same quality as the King James because they followed that same thing. Now, we can argue manuscripts, manuscript families, and things like that. We could argue all that. Although I think some of that is there's a lot of misleading arguments in that. We want to be able to point to, so many thousands of manuscripts so close to the original. And even we even want to be able to say, and look at these ones that are far from the original, and look how little difference there is between all these. We want to point to all of that in the manuscript body to show that the Bible is unique among all the literature of the world in its manuscript evidence support and blah, blah, blah. And then we want to say, but we really don't care about any of that. We really care about this very small subset of the manuscripts. And this translation that we want to assume was built on that small subset of the manuscripts, which, by the way, it wasn't. Right? And there's a lot of fallacious arguments about it out there that a lot of people make, and I think in a way they're dishonest.
They're self-serving for sure.
They are very self-serving.
They're self-serving about which manuscripts they will cite for whatever purpose, and then denigrate them in the next breath.
In the next argument, when they want a different argument, they'll denigrate that very same manuscript. The one who I thought, as much as I disliked him, as in some of his teaching, and that was Peter Ruckman. He at least was honest about one point that I don't want to say he at least was. I've learned so much from Peter Ruckman. I don't want to say he's an evil guy. I think I had some fundamental disagreements with him on some things. But one thing he was honest about that I think very few of them are is that he actually said, the only way I can hold the position I hold is if I'm willing to make a declaration that the King James Bible represents an advanced revelation from God, that it isn't just a translation of the Bible anymore. It's a unique thing, uniquely inspired, not just a translation. It's an inspiration.
And do you think that's a true statement?
No, but he at least was honest enough to acknowledge that he had to say that was the case. Very few others who hold what I would consider an extreme King James position would be honest enough to make that statement.
I see what you're saying.
Right? He was honest in it. Right? And he tried to prove that point multiple times, and in some people's minds he succeeds at it very well. In other people's minds, in my mind, I don't think he succeeds at it as well. Now, that's not to say that I'm not a King James guy, because I am. I don't use the NIV. I don't use the New American Standard. I use the King James. But I have to make this acknowledgement. While I do that, I have to make this acknowledgement. I acknowledge that I'm not unbiased. And my bias comes from an odd place. Both of my parents were journalists. And I told you I grew up on a farm and, joined the Army. But I was not an uneducated farm boy. I don't think there really are any of those, but I was not one of them. both of my parents were journalists who insisted that I use proper English. I've already spoken in ways that my parents would have corrected just in this interview. And so I spoke in very good, very proper English, a high level of English, and I had a very broad vocabulary when I joined the Army. And the first time I met someone from Detroit, inner city Detroit, they used to think I was stuck up because I'd look at them like, and it wasn't. I was trying to figure out what you were saying. Like, I know what means, I know what up means, and I know what a dog is. But when you say "what up, dog," I have no idea what that means. Right? I had a very hard time communicating on that level. So for me, Shakespeare was not unfamiliar in my home. And the King James English is I probably make fewer mistakes handling the King James English than most people do when they handle the King James English. And at the same time, I would say the overwhelming majority of Americans today would be very challenged by the King James Bible. If you handed one to them and said, read the Gospel of John and tell me what you learned, they could read it 5 times and still not tell you the basics of what they learned, still not be able to communicate the basics of it.
I've been reading a number of different translations recently, kind of like in comparison purposes, especially the Net Bible. I don't know if you've looked at that translation.
A little bit.
The New English Translation that was headed up by a committee headed up by Daniel Wallace. Mm-hmm. They're the ones that did that one. I think it's a very very useful work that they did, mainly because of their footnotes. They have like 600,000 footnotes in it,
right?
Where they have documented everything, every decision they made regarding the translation.
Yes,
which actually is useful for many other translations, because most other translations made very similar decisions.
Yes.
They may have come down a little differently in how they implemented it, but they had to face the same decision.
Yes.
So, for instance, I find it useful because they'll like point out where they've broken the sentences, the original sentences, the Greek sentences, up into smaller sentences to make the English more understandable.
Yes.
Because like Ephesians, you'd have 2 sentences in chapter 1,
right,
which is like this huge long sentence. So they break it up, supply the words needed to make the sentence complete. But then they footnote that every single time they do that. They footnote that, which is interesting.
Right.
Right, because most Bibles don't do that.
Most don't. And the King James originally, when you look at the sentence structure, like in Ephesians 1, where you have nested pieces of statements that are nested using colons, semicolons, and commas in that order, right? And periods are rare, but colons, semicolons, commas, and parentheses, right? To try to separate off those pieces of that sentence in the same fashion. Mm-hmm. But most people who read that today do not understand, were never taught how you nest thoughts in these sub-thoughts using separators of colons, semicolons, and commas. That stuff was taught all the way up through the textbooks that I'm able to find teaching that, teach it all the way up through about 1939. Something happened in like 1939 and 1940 where they began to deprecate that way of teaching nesting of thoughts in English, and they taught you to break down sentences smaller, and sentence diagramming was designed to force you to break down sentences, thinking into smaller units of sentences that didn't have all that nested punctuation in it. But the King James does, and most people don't know how to handle it. So they read all of that, and they're naturally breaking it down into sentences, but they're breaking it down wherever they see it in their mind, or wherever the voice they heard reading it broke it down. So it's good to see a committee who says, we broke it this way, and here's why.
Yes, I think that very good. I love the Net Bible because of that. I look at it all the time because it gives you good information as to what the underlying text was, where how the sentences ran,
Right.
which actually the King James did some of it, right? They broke like Ephesians into 3 sentences, I think, in the King James, where it's 2 in the
Yeah,
Greek.
yeah.
So they've done it also, just
Yes,
less.
they had no choice. Just
They did
less.
it less than the Net, right? And as far as I know, they didn't notate that they had done that. I don't believe they did. But anyways,
There were notes. There were plenty of notes, but they were never published with it. Right. The committee noted things, but
right, I'm
for
talking
their
about
own
where it comes in like a footnote or
No.
a margin note. They did a lot of margin notes on other issues, but I don't think they did as to how they broke up the sentences or whatever. Now there is good indication of it because we have the italicized words.
Right.
So when a sentence starts off with italicized words, often that is an indication that was actually is a broken sentence. They
Yes.
restarted the sentence,
Yes.
supplied the necessary words to complete it.
Yes.
And you can know that by just seeing those italicized words if it starts the sentence off.
yeah,
and that's a good
and
indication.
only if the print edition that you have uses those italicizations.
Correct. Right. Exactly.
Not all do.
No, not all do. But that's a real good. But the Net Bible actually just has a marker. They actually have every one of these notated, which is very interesting. Anyways, my point of that though is, in comparing these, while the Net Bible I think is more understandable for people, I think if you read the Net Bible, it's much more comprehensible than the King James Bible as far as you can understand what it's saying. I find it's because often it's more interpretive.
Yes.
And so they are supplying more interpretation than the King James Bible is supplying,
Yes.
which I don't like.
Right.
Right? That's why I'm still a very, very ardent supporter of the King James translation,
Right.
even though I wish it could be more modern in its
Yeah.
grammar mainly, not the vocabulary, but the grammar.
Even the vocabulary could stand some modernization.
It can stand some help. But to me, vocabulary is something you can get from a dictionary easily, especially if like a supplied one in the back or whatever.
Yes.
But grammar is not. Grammar's
Yeah.
hard to fix like that.
Yes.
And I just have too much personal experience with people I deal with who cannot understand the grammar of the King James Bible, and I find that regrettable because
Grammatically, it's complex. Grammatically, it's not a straightforward grammar. It's not like you can say, oh, there used to be these old rules of grammar. And if you can learn these 5 old rules of grammar, you can understand the King James. It's not that way. Grammatically, it's very complex. And those grammatically nested, understanding where an actual parenthesis and a colon specified parenthesis and a semicolon specified list separation and a comma separated list, all of that is, and it's not all as consistent as we would want it to be. There are places where it's
correct.
obvious, and there are places where it actually spans a chapter separation, and they had very little way to indicate that. So it's very complex in the King James.
It is, but it's reflective of the complexity of the original text.
Yes, it is.
Which is important, which is why it's not as interpretive.
That's right.
So the moment you start trying to make that easier, which is laudable, I think it's a laudable thing to try to accomplish, because that's what a preacher's trying to do from the pulpit. He's trying
Yes,
to make that
absolutely.
understandable.
Absolutely.
A true let's say a teacher, just to get the terminology right. A true teacher of the scriptures from the pulpit
Yes.
is doing nothing more than producing a more understandable version of the Bible.
Yeah, I wouldn't say nothing more.
Okay, that's a little exaggerated,
Yeah,
but that's what
yes.
they're doing.
Yes, but that is what their aim is, right?
Yes, that's my point is.
Trying to get the understanding of what the Bible is into your head.
That's right.
That's right.
And that version that you're putting in your head is a simplified version of what you're reading.
Yes.
And so, to me, it's a laudable goal to try to accomplish. But I don't see how it gets accomplished without doing harm to the built-in complexity of the text as it was originally written.
Right, it oversimplifies to the point where you actually can miss things
Yes.
that are in the original text.
Like I compare the Net Bible and the King James translation, and it's like, I really like how they've done it,
Yes.
And it's very understandable.
Yes.
And yet,
And they got the main points right.
yes. And yet
But there are
there's
shades
some
they
there's
miss.
some flavor that is not there. There is some shades of meaning that have
Yes.
been sacrificed
That's right.
to obtain this.
To obtain that. And they admit that. They're
course.
not dishonest about it. They're
No.
not dishonest in the least. They admit that it's going to cause that problem when we do this. And so the footnotes try to compensate for that by saying we made this choice for understandability.
That's right.
Right. And that kind of honesty has got to be admired, right? But take it out of that for just a second. I don't know. It's like in lectures to my students, Spurgeon writes this terribly titled chapter in today's world. It's titled Ministers with a Slender Apparatus.
Oh, that would definitely not make it out of the editing room.
And what he actually means is ministers with a small library.
Mm-hmm.
But he doesn't want to title it a small library because he's actually not making a point of library. He's actually saying their apparatus for understanding the scripture is not very robust. They have one or two commentaries, perhaps, and other books in their library that are topical. And that's the challenge with a lot of Christian literature, no matter where it appears in history, is that it tends to be topical, right? Which means it's not exegetical at all. And it's not meant to be exegetical. So getting exegetical study apparatus, well, that's voluminous. And that means a lot of money.
Yeah.
But just thinking about that
Especially in his day.
Especially in his day.
Yeah.
And so thinking about that for just a moment, consider what he's actually saying. He would never be one to say, you need more than the Bible. Right? That's a fallacious argument, right? To say, all you really need is the Bible. You don't need all these other books. Anybody who comes to you with the Bible in one hand and a book in a different book in another hand, you don't need to listen to them, right? You need to listen to somebody who's got the Bible, and that's all they need is the Bible. Yeah, but then why did Spurgeon write this entire little diatribe on how do you help a minister who doesn't have more than just the Bible, right? If all he's got is the Bible, Spurgeon thinks he's at a serious disadvantage, right? Mm-hmm. So, and why does Spurgeon think that? He thinks that because he's looking at him saying he has very little way to understand all the thoughts that are in this because all he's got is what's in his head and what's on that one page in front of him. Whereas there's so much more there that he's going to miss in his own thoughts and what's on the page. He needs somebody who can help him get through that. So he would see them as needing an apparatus. When you look at Wesley's recommendation for what women ought to study, as much as people, this is one of my things that I point back to and say, you don't understand history and you don't understand Christian history when you're thinking Christian history is a matriarchy. People put down women.
A patriarchy.
A patriarchy where men put down women, right? Because Wesley thought women should study math, logic, English, Latin. I mean, he's got a whole list of things women should study because he said women should not be ignorant. They should be well educated. It should not be easy for a man to come along and fool your wife or your daughter. Therefore, you need to teach your wife and your daughter these things, like math and logic and things like that. Now, when was the last time you heard a preacher stand in the pulpit and say, you need to study logic and math
and Latin.
And Latin if you're really going to understand the world and be able to get along in the world and understand the Bible.
We'd have palpitations and fainting in the pews, Mike, if we said that.
If you said that. And I'm going to tell you right now, if you don't study basic logic, look, we believe in an open meeting. Anyone who comes into our meeting can share, and we want them to. I want them to. I want somebody to share whatever has inspired them in their faith. I don't care what it is. If it's bad doctrine, we're going to make a judgment call on it. And we're going to ask the question of, I'm looking around at the people here. Are these people going to be misled by that? No. Okay, let it go. I'm not even going to say anything about it, right? If it's egregious and I think it's seriously misleading, then we might stand up after them and correct it. But chances are not going to happen. Chances are we're trying to teach people exegetical Bible study daily from the pulpit. That's what we try to do, right? And so we're not so afraid of them being misled. But we might go to that person afterward and say, do you realize you said this? And, have a conversation one-on-one with them afterwards.
Correct.
That's a different issue. But if you're going to persuade someone of your position, you must have some sound reasoning behind it. Not just saying, that's what the Lord gave me out of that passage. Not just saying, that's what I understand out of that passage.
Agreed.
That's useless.
But it also it is a belief that it is a persuasion that the scriptures themselves were written with sound reasoning.
Yes.
If you don't have the ability to follow and comprehend logical reasoning,
Yes.
you are not going to comprehend a large portion of the scriptures,
Huge portion.
at least.
And what I would make the argument that you're not going to understand the most important parts of Scripture. Now, some people would get mad when I say that because they would say every part of Scripture is important. And I would say,
Well, then
yes.
why do we have some of it highlighted in red?
Right.
Directly from the pen of the apostles. They used ready on the important parts.
Oh, you're hurting me now. We're not going down that rabbit trail. Okay, we're going to stay off it. I will say this. Just consider how carefully worded the following statement is. If ye then, being evil, know how to give good gifts, how much more your heavenly Father. Now, that is nothing but a pure logic statement. I could write that out in symbolic logic with just one or two words in the middle. That is a symbolic logic statement. You could write that in code. You could write the if statement, if then else statement in code for that, right? And hand back the conclusion. And he's stating it. Those words came out of Jesus' mouth as a statement of logic to force you into a point. When he says, whose image and inscription is this? Caesar. Then who really owns this? The answer is absolutely pure logic. This has nothing to do with emotion.
He didn't quote a verse. He didn't go back and quote the Old Testament and says, well, Moses said, this is how we should handle this.
He's forcing you to think. And the thought you're supposed to think at that moment is, and he does this all the time, who then was that man's neighbor? Well, I suppose it was the Samaritan. Well, you suppose correctly. In other words, quit supposing and arrive at a conclusion here. All right? You're right in the way you're thinking. It was the Samaritan. Now, the next question that should come to your mind, if you're at all a thinking human being, is, what impact does that have on me? So I'm going to give you that answer. Go thou and do likewise. Right? I mean, he's reasoning with those people. And that's why they say, no man spoke like this. Because not only did he speak with authority, he forced you by the power of his reason to acknowledge that authority was right and anything else you were thinking was wrong. He was exclusive in that right. And when I say the most important parts of Scripture, I'm actually trying to refer to the writings of Paul.
Correct.
Because Paul is meticulously logical. Now, he doesn't always use the methodological, logical analysis that we always appreciate today. He often uses metaphorical logical analysis. He uses a lot of what if to get us there. But mathematicians do that all the time.
Sure, and so do physicists.
Can I imagine a way that this could work? No. There's no way I can make that work out. Well, then, that is at least part of the proof that this other thing must be true. And we use that in when we're in that statistical analysis we were talking about at the beginning, when you're looking at that sample. You ask a question about that sample. with a hypothesis, and there's a great book on this. It's becoming rare and therefore expensive, called In Search of a Wild Hypothesis by Bell Labs, and in which they essentially walk you through how this works in very common lay terms. And their point in doing so is they're saying, in order for a mathematician to actually be able to say, this is what the data is telling, or a scientist or a physicist to say, this is what the data is saying, they must have a way of separating what they want the data to say from what the data actually says. And they do this by forming what's called a null hypothesis. And the null hypothesis is a way of saying that the data means nothing. The data is not saying anything important at all. And so you must formulate a null hypothesis, a way of saying that the data itself is meaningless. And then you attempt to prove the null hypothesis to be true. You try to prove that the data is absolutely meaningless. And if your attempt to prove that the data is meaningless fails, then by logic, the data must be meaningful. It must mean something. So instead of just saying, look, I have all this data, and all this data proves my point. And you find people doing that with the scripture all the time. I have all these proof texts that prove my point. Here's a better way to do it instead. Go searching for everything that would disprove your point. And if you cannot disprove your point, then you can
that
assume
would
your
bring
point is
that
true.
would be to bring the scientific method to
That
bear.
would be to bring the scientific method to the Bible. And I know some people would say, we don't need the scientific method. Well, Paul used it.
Yeah.
He would say, well, then what are we going to say? Should we sin more that grace might abound? Well, then he goes about to show that that can't be true. He starts with a null hypothesis, and then he goes about to prove that the null hypothesis can't be true. But that's logic, and he uses that frequently, and he does it by metaphor that way. He sets up this target, and he sets that target, the null hypothesis, to be a robust null hypothesis. You can't treat this thing lightly. You have to really state that null hypothesis very careful. That's how come in some formal forms of philosophy we talk about the ability to disprove something. If something is not disprovable, then the likelihood of it being true is very low, right? Because it can't be negated.
Right.
And if you can't state a null hypothesis, then you say, my experiment can neither be validated nor invalidated. I have to perform a different experiment because I can't write a null hypothesis for this.
Well, that is a difficulty that I've had with the doctrinal approach of evangelical Christianity for a while. Is that they have a approach that is not falsifiable.
That's right.
And they are often, many of them are appalled that you would suggest that they should consider what possible truth or what possible discovery could be presented to them that would make them realize that they're in error.
That's right.
They can't, and many of them cannot even. I did this once in my Spanish podcast. I asked the audience, what would you accept as evidence that Christianity is not true?
Right.
And no one could give me an answer. They didn't
Right.
have a single thing that they could say. If you could prove this,
That's right. Then
just
you would say,
hypothetically, if
Right.
you could prove this,
right.
then I would agree it's false.
So
No,
I
there
had
is nothing.
I had a college professor one time who, he was a philosophy professor, and I had very interesting arguments with him in class, right? And he was willing. He didn't just I had several philosophy professors in college who would put you down as a Christian very early. They didn't want to have any of that real discussion in their class, or when they did, you could tell they actually hated you.
There's a disdain.
There's a disdain for your position. This guy was not that way. We had very interesting discussions, but he came in and presented an argument. He said, this is my personal argument about it. If there was a God, he could not prove to me that he exists. And here was the basis of his argument. He said, well, how could he possibly prove it to me that he's God? Now, he might be able to prove he exists, but he can't prove he's God. And I said, well, how do you get that? He goes, well, how? He says, let's say God comes to me and he says, I'm God, believe in me. And I said, well, prove it. He said, well, what do you want me to do? Anything you want me to do, I'll do that. And I said, okay, see those mountains over there? We're in Colorado at the time, so he points out the window at the mountains. You see those mountains over there? Turn them over on their top and spin them like a top. And let's say he does it. That doesn't prove he's God. It proves he may be a very good illusionist. It also could prove that he's stronger than I am and smarter than I am, more capable of things than I am, but it doesn't make him God. There's no way he could prove that he is God to me. And I said, so in other words, the only proof that you would accept that there is a God is if you were God. And he said, that is the first argument, the first sensible argument I've heard of that. And that was the end of class that day. He took 30 minutes to go through his. I took a couple seconds for mine, and we ended 10 minutes early. But that was but the point is, he's actually saying my stand on God is not falsifiable. And when I said, then the only way that you could accept it is if you had enough knowledge so that you yourself were God. And most atheists, by the way, are in that same point. And I myself was an atheist for a time, and I had that problem. That was my problem with my atheism, was that I could not. I had skepticism about I was a skeptic about my skepticism, right? I had that problem with
And
it.
went to an infinite regress on that, huh?
Yeah, no, actually, it's not infinite. It actually ends in one of two places. All atheism, all forms of atheism. If you're out there today and you're watching this, and you're toying in your mind with the concept of atheism or agnosticism, however you want to term it, you're at one of 2 points. You're going to end in one of 2 points. And there's only 2 points you can end it. There's a third option, but you can't actually end up there. That third option is called illusion. In that option, everything we are is an illusion. Everything we are is a simulation, right? But that is not
we're in
really,
the matrix.
We're in the matrix kind of thing, right? But that is not actually a viable option for you to end up in, right? And there's 1,000 reasons why. And if you just give it for some thought for a second, you realize you can't end up there, because if that's the case, you are a miniature mind produced by another mind that actually does exist somewhere. And is there more than one of them or only one of them? And if there's only one of them, then it's God. And if there's more than one of them, then you're at the same problem. How do you know that they're not a simulation? And you're in this infinite regress again. And that is not a pos. But most atheism ends up in one of 2 points. And those 2 points I describe as absolute determinism or absolute ignorance. Now, absolute determinism is the one that says that everything that exists today is a function of the Big Bang. That is, every molecule can be traced on a line back to the Big Bang. There's no such thing as randomness. Randomness is the word we use to describe when we want to stop studying the thing, and we say, well, beyond that point, I just don't care, and I'm going to call it random. That's what I call the region of my ignorance is random. And nothing is actually random. If we knew the math formulas, we could actually tell you why everything is there. There's no free will. There's no such thing as an individual. There's no such thing as mind. Everything you are is just a function of matter, and it's a function of the Big Bang, and it's absolutely determined. And even the words you're saying right now are predetermined by the explosion. You think you're making choices, but it's an illusion. You're not. Everything is a function of that. And therefore, all of the universe is meaningless, right? In which case, we should just shoot them, right? That's always my response to that. In which case, I should just shoot you. Because killing people can be very natural to somebody. And what value are you? Nothing has any value anymore other than relatively to something else, but even relative to something else doesn't make any sense, because everything is meaningless. And therefore, when everything is meaningless, nothing has value, and there is no morality. You can't say something is good, or you can't say something is bad. You can't even say something is better or something is worse. That's an illusion, too, because those thoughts themselves are just pre-programmed by the explosion of material from the beginning of the universe, right? So you're either at that point, that you end at that point, or you end at a point of absolute ignorance. And the point of absolute ignorance says we actually can't really know anything. Knowledge itself is this illusion of all things, we don't even know what matter is. What we think of as material and strong, like this microphone and this desk, that appear to have functionality, are actually indeterminate in space and time. And the actual quantum experiment of reality puts us in a place of absolute unknowingness, right? Not only can I not be certain about the motion of a particle and the energy of a particle or the position of that particle in time, I actually can't be sure that it's a particle, right? It may be a wavicle, or it may be neither one of those. It might be a vibration in some pre-quantum universe and some sheet of something somewhere, some string on a sheet. And therefore, everything we have appears to be in 3 dimensions, but it isn't. And we don't know anything, and nothing we know is actually true, right? And therefore, there is no truth. There is no reality. You end up in one of those 2 places as an atheist if you want to carry it to its ultimate position. But you can't actually live in either one of those positions. So you always back off that position to an extent. And when you back off of that position, you're going to back into one of 2 positions. You're going to back into the position that says everything is relative, or the position from the other side that says everything is as meaningful as I can make it. And when you get to those 2 positions, you've gotten to a position of faith. Now, to be in one of those other 2 positions doesn't require faith. It requires a willingness to be unknowing and ignorant. But you're going to have a really hard time saying, I'm an atheist, I demand evidence.
Right.
I demand scientific evidence and proof for things, because neither one of those, string theory cannot be proven, right? So this side of absolute ignorance can't be proven. And the idea that everything is predetermined by the Big Bang can't be proven either. You don't have enough math to pull that off, and nobody ever will. And there are reasons why we know that's not a provable point. And therefore you come to a point where you can live, which is somewhere off of that, and that is a point of faith. But then if you denigrate all other points of faith, you're doing it arbitrarily, right? And you're claiming evidence for yours. And so I had a very hard time being an atheist. I was an atheist, and I was a strong atheist. But I had these conversations with other atheists where they would say, all you are is confused. And I would say, no, I'm actually clear. I think you're confused. You actually think you are an atheist and you have some proof for your atheism. But every time I question your proof for your atheism, you get nowhere. You say likelihood. It's more likely that there isn't a God than that there is a God. But when you say more likely that there isn't than there is, then I question the basis of your statement of likelihood. Well, then, on what do you base likelihood in that case, right? Now, if I'm dealing with a deck of 52 cards, and you pull out if I say this is a fair deck of 52 cards, and you pull out King of Spades, I can say the likelihood of finding another King of Spades in that deck is 0. But if you say you pull out a Jack of Clubs, and then you ask me what's the likelihood that the next card is a King of Spades, I can tell you that likelihood because I know the frequency. But you can't tell me how likely it is that there is a God or not a God, because you have no frequency distribution to go by. And if you say, well, I'm going to do it in a Bayesian method, well, the Bayesian method says, given that. Well, what are you basing the give on?
Right.
So you guys, I had a very hard problem with it, and it was challenging to my mind to be an atheist.
How did you become an atheist? Was your family that?
No, my family wasn't, and my family didn't know I went through that. You have to understand, my family is the greatest people in the world. I was the problem child of all problem children. I was severely learning disabled. I hated the whole world by 2nd grade. I remember walking home one day in 2nd grade saying, this entire world can go to hell, and if there's anybody in this world who's having a hard time making their decision or slow getting there, I'll be happy to help them along. Right? I just hated the whole world. And my family was Catholic.
And why would you hate the whole world?
Because I think so different. And and I wasn't liked by the other kids. And I had nuns for teachers, and they should never have been teachers. They had no business teaching anybody anything. They were disciplinarians, but not teachers, and they weren't very good disciplinarians. And I just, I had a great childhood, but a terrible experience in school. And when it was getting into school that made me so hate the world. And being forced to sit still for a period of time was, to me, the dumbest, worst thing that anybody could do to me. And I really despised it. And to this day, there are people who say, oh, so you were just an undisciplined child. No, I was a very high energy child in a world that didn't care about that. And so when I figured out that the other kids didn't like me, my natural response to that was, then I don't like you either. In fact, I hate you, right? I've never been accused of being extreme, right?
No.
So it took it to an extreme, and I was just that way, right? And so I got in fights a lot. I severely wounded a teacher at one point, and I was in like third grade at the time, and I was a terrible kid. But my parents were the greatest parents in the world, and my mother had almost infinite patience with me, and she would very carefully walk me through my thinking process, and they were very loving people. My home was a great home. I didn't have any, it wasn't that. My family was terrific. When I was a sophomore in high school, I decided, if I'm going to do this, if I'm going to be a good Catholic, I'm going to read the Bible. But I wasn't going to do it in front of everybody, and I was not a good reader at the time. I've since become a good reader, but that was a very big challenge. So if you're out there today and you say, I'm just not a good reader, get over it. It's possible to get over it, right? So I'm proof. So, but the Bible that I chose to read was one I got off my dad's bookshelf, and it was a paperback King James Bible, which wasn't a Catholic Bible. And I started in the Old Testament and realized I'm never going to make this through this book this way. I want to jump to the end. So I went to Revelations and thought, I don't understand anything in here, and this is the silliest thing I ever read in my life. So then I found the division between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So I started in the Gospels, and I was reading through the Gospels. And I probably had read all 4 Gospels, and I had lots of questions. So I made an audience with my local priest, and I sat with him and I said, I have some questions. How is it that Jesus tells his disciples, call no man father, and yet you instruct me to do so? And how is it that nowhere that I can find in here does anyone venerate Mary, and yet you ask me to do that? In fact, you tell me I'm instructed to do that.
And what was his response to these?
His response to that was, it wasn't the simple thing that you would think. Being non-Catholic, I think it's very hard for most non-Catholics to understand actual Catholic thought on this, because they haven't actually studied it, right? Mm-hmm. And actual Catholics are not ignorant of this at all. So first of all, he went into some Greek stuff, and I just didn't have a lot of patience for that. And I said, okay, ignoring that for just a minute, because the problem is I find the same wording in the English version of the Catholic Bible. So you can't tell me, well, there's a secret behind the scenes that makes it different than what it's worded at. We have to deal with the way it's worded, right?
Right.
Okay. So then it was, you have to understand, Revelation has always been progressive. And by the way, this is a really good argument, if you think about it for a minute.
It is a very good argument.
It's a very good argument. Revelation has
before
always been
before you get there, I would say that many evangelical portrayals of certain doctrines actually depend on that argument.
Yes, they do. They do.
How they interpret the Bible,
yes,
and their methodology depends on the idea that the way you determine if an interpretation is accurate is if it is orthodox.
Yes.
Which means that progressive revelation has shown this to be true
Yes.
And that's how you know, because if we take the methodology of many evangelicals and look at false teachings, what we would consider false, they're using the same methodologies.
They are using the same methodology, even though they don't want to admit it. They would deny it.
And they would say, but theirs is wrong because it's not orthodox,
That's right.
which means it doesn't conform to the teachings of the church, is what that means.
That's right. That's right. And so that was essentially the argument.
Correct.
But in my mind, I couldn't buy the argument because I said, so here's what you're telling me in the end. You're telling me that the authority of the church gives you the authority to change what Jesus said in the scriptures. The scriptures give you the authority to change the scriptures. And if that's the case, then nothing we believe has any meaning anymore at all, right? Now, it took a long time to get there, and I am really summarizing for brevity's sake, but it's not a bad argument, and people should really try to understand the Catholic argument on that if they're going to argue with Catholics or if they're going to debate with Catholics. And by the way, I don't actually think there's a lot of reason to debate with Catholics on this. I actually think if people would go back and read the arguments between Sadaletto and Calvin, the letters that Sadaletto and Calvin wrote to each other, you will find that that's a better discussion for Protestants to have with Catholics than the anti-Mary, the Mariolatry, or whatever you want to call it, discussions that and the anti-idol worship discussions that most Protestants try to have with Catholics, right? That's a far better argument base to have, and it's really the crux of the problem, right? The crux of the problem that Catholics have isn't idolatry. That is not the real problem.
What's the real problem?
Justification. What is justification? You can repent of idolatry and still not understand justification. Still see justification the way Catholics see justification. Once you see justification the way we find it in the book of Romans, once you understand the arguments he's laying it down in the book of Romans concerning justification by faith, then idols become meaningless to you immediately. And you repent of idolatry because you repent of trying to be justified by the wrong means. And that's the heart of the argument. So I would suggest people go back and read that, but most Protestants don't want to read. And reading Calvin and Sadaletto it's not light reading. You're reading two men who understand their position and are arguing it out. And by the way, I would also suggest reading at least some brief record of the Salamanca school, right? And the Salamanca school was a Catholic school. I want to say a monastery. It was actually more like a university in Salamanca, Spain. And they came to an argument. And if you read that argument, if you read the way they were arguing, you would think you were reading post-Reformation Calvinists and Arminians arguing with each other. You would think that's what you were reading. But they weren't. They were all Catholic priests arguing with each other about predestination. The same way, same arguments, same wording, exactly the same discussions. I'm telling you, Protestants who think Catholics are ignorant and just follow, you do not understand history and you've never read it, right? Go back and read that.
Well, they're conflating the average Catholic that you're going to meet on the streets of Mexico, for instance,
yes,
with those that are actually devout. It's the same way as if you were to meet an average evangelical
or Pentecostal
or Protestant or whatever in the streets of the U.S. at the job, your job. I'm an Episcopalian,
right?
And they couldn't find Matthew in the Bible,
right?
And say, well, then Christians are ignorant. Christianity is ignorant,
or Protestants are ignorant.
You're right.
Of this stuff,
Protestantism
right?
is ignorant. The movement is ignorant because I met an ignorant Protestant.
Right. It's exactly the same thing, right? And by the way, the Pope had to step in on that one and said, neither one of you can know the answer to what you're asking. And here's where it lies. And if you look at the way he drew the way
he divided the baby,
if you look at the way he did it, you'd be like, I hate to say it, but I agree with him on that one. I don't want to agree with the Pope, but I do. And it'd be very hard for you, right? So I suggest we get out of our shell a little bit and read. But so that was his thing for me. And I said, I can't buy your argument because what you're saying is the Bible gave you the right to say that what the Bible said wasn't true. Well, by a strange set of coincidences, I ended up with an audience with the bishop on a separate subject. And he had spare time that day. And so after we talked about the other topic, which was a political movement at the time, political topic, and I was very interested in politics at the time and thought of being a politician. And we were dealing with...
you realized that you had to like people or at least be able to pretend that?
No, that wasn't the problem. The problem was I like people, but I don't like politicians. Michigan at the time had this thing they called state equalized valuation, a way that they funded their public schools and your property tax wasn't actually related to its value. They equalized value across an area in attempts to alleviate discrepancies in impoverished areas, which we would in Michigan, at that time was predominantly what we would consider African American or black neighborhoods today, and they attempted to get around funding of education to beef up the education in those areas through changing the way the property tax system worked. But that presented a lot of problems, right? It didn't actually raise the level of education in those areas, and it actually took away parts of education like band and auto shop and metal shop and wood shop from other areas in the state. So it lowered the education level in one area but didn't raise it in the other area. And the argument the politicians said was, you need to give us time. And the answer was, you're just hiring more administrators. And why don't you quit hiring administrators and fund teachers instead of administrators? And so we had this whole argument going. And when the school system said, no, we're going to do away with all these non-core things, I started a thing that said, we're going to change it. We're going to come up with the funding for that. And so I did a calculation, said if we just collected 25 cents for everybody in this county, we could fund it for 3 counties, right, which was a consolidated school district across the counties. And so we went out and had this little operation, raised all this money, and the school board refused to accept it, said they couldn't accept funding from that source. So we anticipated that because there was a school board leader that I suspected highly at the time. So we organized a bus trip to the governor. And the day that that they meet on Tuesday night, the school board met on Tuesday night and said, we can't accept it because we can't accept funding from that source. We were at the steps of the Michigan State Capitol the next day, and Governor Milliken came in, and we made the argument to him on the steps, and he said, absolutely, Ken, there's nothing that will stop them from doing that. And we had him on camera on press, and we had the check with us. And we said they had a copy of this giant check, and which they refused to accept. He said, this must be a misunderstanding. I'll make a phone call. They'll accept it. And sure enough, they did.
So anyways, you're with the bishop.
That's when I realized. And that so I was with the bishop, and the bishop gave me exactly that same argument, almost word for word, that the priest had. And I said, well, if the Catholic Church isn't right, nobody's right.
And why would you conclude that?
Because I was a Catholic.
Okay.
And I believe that the Catholic Church had the pure truth, and that all the Protestant religions and all that had a form of the truth. That's what I've been taught. Mm-hmm. A form of the truth, but it wasn't as pure. They weren't evil, and they weren't destined to hell because they weren't Catholic. But they didn't have the whole truth like we did. They were missing a great deal. And so I gave up. Now, my family never knew, because I loved my family and I loved my parents, and I wasn't out to stir the pot with my family, and I could never tell my family I couldn't tell my daddy was wrong. I just couldn't, I couldn't tell my mom she was wrong. Now, if they were to go back in their memory, my dad has passed away since then, and if they were to go back in their memory and look at it, they would realize that at that point, I got deep into Eastern mysticism, Eastern religion, because I thought, well, if I would go to this form of belief that at least acknowledged a dimension that was beyond what we could see, because clearly energy is something I don't see, but it's a dimension that exists. So I didn't want to completely rule it out and leave my family thinking that. And I kept up. I was an altar boy. I was a lay Eucharistic minister. I kept all of that going. I wasn't going to give up any of that. But everybody, or not everybody, but some significant people at school knew that I was an atheist. And I stayed that way until I was in the Army. And I was reduced through an odd set of circumstances to the point where I was nothing but what I was inside. Just hatred and anger. And I was forced to acknowledge that there just wasn't anything of any value or goodness there at all. And that is when I found a gospel tract. And that is...
A gospel tract.
So walking across the field.
Where?
On Fort Hood, Texas. I was in Fort Hood, Texas. My bicycle, I had pulled guard duty the night before. I got the day off, or CQ, I can't remember. Got the day off. Had to get out of the barracks because there's this thing called the Hey You roster in the Army, which is they need something done and you happen to be handy. And it doesn't matter that you're supposed to be off duty right now because you were on CQ all night. If you're there, hey, you, do this, right? So I didn't want to be on the Hey You roster, so I hopped on my bike and rode off base and sat in Dunkin' Donuts for a while. And actually, it was Shipley Donuts, and my favorite donuts. And then I was like, but I'm exhausted. I'm tired. And I figured all the major things are done. I'm going to go back. It's about, almost noon, 1 o'clock. Go back right after the 1 o'clock formation. I could sleep all afternoon and the evening and be good to go the next morning. So I was going back, and both tires went flat. And I'm forced to walk my bike across this field. And I don't normally ride across that field because I ride on the road. But it's a shortcut, and I'm walking. So I cut across this field, and in the middle of the field, I find this gospel tract. And it caught my eye because it looks like a check. And it says Bank of Heaven on the front of it. And on the back of it said Christian Servicemen Center in Killeen. It says, and the rubber stamp said, the one place in Killeen not looking for your money. And I was like, no. I know religion. These guys want my money, and I'm going to prove it. And I'm going to tell everybody these guys are liars. So I went back and fixed my tires and went down there.
That same day?
Same day. And I got there I took a nap. And I got there like 4 o'clock. They were just opening up again because they closed in the afternoon for a couple hours. And got back at 4 o'clock. And just when they were opening, nobody's around except there's a woman in the kitchen doing something. I don't know what she's doing. And there's this old guy named Gaylord Chisholm. And Gaylord was the most annoying witness I have ever known in my life because he absolutely refuses to argue with you about anything. He would just say, I would bring out some argument. He'd say, well, he's very welcoming. And big guy, 6'4", big guy. Come on in. He had big hands, right? Come on in, welcome. I don't recognize you. Are you a Christian? No, I'm not a Christian. I'm actually an atheist. Well, we're glad you came in today. Yeah, I bet you are, And I was like, yeah. So, how do you fund this place? Oh, everything here is funded by churches somewhere else in the state. Everything here is free to the GI. Nothing here is. And I said, yeah, but you have books over there that are for sale. He said that everything, all those books that you buy are at cost. I can hand you the catalog. He said, I can't afford to just give you all the books in the world. But if you want them there, it costs, less than you would pay at a bookstore, right? They're at wholesale cost here. He says, but I don't make that money. I just bought the book for that much, and you're paying for it. I don't charge you for shipping. I was like, so I was frustrated. And so we started arguing. He said, so you say you're an atheist. Why are you an atheist? Well, no, that's a tough question for an atheist to answer, right? And that's a long question to answer. And I didn't want to go into the long version, so I said, I just don't have enough evidence for God. And he said, I see. So then he would open the Bible, and he didn't start where you and I might start, which is the fool hath said in his heart there is no God, right? That's where we might start, but that's because we're insulting people. He has no intention of insulting anybody, right? He just said, he went to where it said, the firmament declares the handiwork of God. And his way of witnessing was to ask you to read it out loud to him and then tell him what it meant. Now, if you're thinking about that, and back to that discussion on interpreting the scripture, right? What he's actually doing is he's having you understand the scripture. And if you get it wrong, he's going to look at you kind of confused. Read that to me again. Because I didn't. And then he read and said, what did you say that meant? Until you got it right. That's his way of witnessing. He's not actually declaring anything to you. He's just getting you there.
He's getting you to say it yourself.
You say it yourself, right? And he's not. He doesn't spend like 10 minutes asking questions after the passage. He would just wait for you to think about it for a minute. He's very patient, right? He's not trying to close the deal in a day, right? And so he's letting you walk this little journey you're going to walk. And he knows this is not an easy journey for people to walk down, right? In fact, he's the first one who ever told me that the most miserable person you're ever going to meet is the person who's just about to get saved.
And so you were the most miserable in your life at that point?
I didn't know that at the time, right? He didn't tell me that day, right? It was much later he told me that. And so that's why he sought out miserable people. It was his nature to seek out miserable people. There was a day, they closed down in the middle of the afternoon, and after a number of years that I'd been there, I was allowed to stay during that time. And it was in the middle of that time they were closed down. I was there with another brother at the time, Gene Solberg, when there's this pounding on the door. And we usually didn't answer it, but it kept pounding. And I went out there, and there's these 3 obviously prostitutes standing out there by the door. I mean, scantily dressed. And I'm like, I'm not letting them in. So I went and told Gene Solberg about it. And Gene said, well, we got to find out if they need something. So we opened the door and stepped out to talk to them. And as soon as we opened the door, they're like, where is he? And we're like, I'm sorry. What do you mean? Where is he? Who? Nobody came in here. Nobody ran in here. Nobody. And it took him a minute for us to understand. And Gene was the one who figured out they're talking about Gaylord. Where's Gaylord? Well, he'd been sick for a couple of weeks. Well, we knew he went. He would always say, I'm going to go hand out tracts. And he'd disappear for a while. Well, what he was doing was he would go downtown, which was only 6 blocks from there, right? He would walk down there. And he would stand there and get to know them, find out where they were from, what their family was like. And he did not preach to them. He just cared about them. And he would ask them when last time was they ate. He would get them some coffee, and he would just talk. He just generally talked, and he never preached to them. And he would always tell them, we're here, we're Christians. We know you don't agree with us, but we want you to know we care. And the only way we can show that is to just let you know we're here when you need something, right? So when you need something, don't forget about us, because we're right over there in the Christian Serviceman Center, right? And he would leave, if they wanted a tract, he would leave them one, but that was it, right? They didn't even know his name. They just called him the old guy. Where's the old guy? Did he die? They were worried that he died. Well, Gene's response was brilliant. He said, you've clearly come to understand that Mr. Chisholm cares about you. Well, yeah, we do. But you don't understand that all he's really doing is showing you how much God cares about you. And he was able to lead those 3 prostitutes to the Lord that day, standing out in front of the Christian Serviceman Center.
Wow.
And so that was Gaylord. That was the way he was. He was not what we're thinking of today when we're thinking of street ministry. That was not his ministry at all. He did not stand on a corner and preach to somebody loudly. He would have thought that was an absolute waste of time and energy. I don't know why we admire it. I tried it for a long time. I was a street preacher for a long time. But even when you think about it in Mexico, you didn't lead people to the Lord from standing on the corner of the street preaching to him. You just made yourself well-known enough to set up a Bible study so you could actually get to know him personally and do it. And that was a great way to get in the house and get to know him personally, right? And they got to know that you weren't afraid to say you disagreed with them and some things. Maybe there were a few who were led to the Lord on the street, but I tend to doubt it. Were there?
Not that I'm aware of.
Right.
I would be remiss to say that there were none, because there's always something, right?
Yeah.
But no, generally you would end up having a discussion with them. You'd go to their home,
Yes.
talk to them, and it would be a process. They'd come to the meetings, or
Yes.
what often would happen with me, I got very few Bible studies for whatever reason. I'm not good at on a personal level. So I would very few, like in the home, I would do that. But I would get a lot of people would come to our church and come to the meetings because they saw me down there street preaching.
Yes.
And it was a real draw for our church in that way. I mean,
Right.
a lot of people came.
Right. Now
But they
it's
would
less
get
of a draw.
saved, but then somebody would then
Yes.
interact with them, would start going to their home. Nobody got we didn't push for conversion on the
Right,
spot
right.
at all.
Right.
In fact, we would drag our feet on that and want them to really understand what they were getting into and what salvation was before.
Right. Right.
So it was usually weeks or even months.
Right. And that was Gaylord Chisholm's way too, right? His preaching on the street was never an attraction really in modern America, right? I mean, it's never been a great attraction. And I have led people to the Lord before preaching on the street, although that was in Killeen back when there was a street that people walked on
Right.
downtown. That doesn't even exist anymore. And it was usually people who knew they shouldn't have been there. They were on the edge anyway. They came from a Christian home, and they knew they should have been saved, and they shouldn't be there. And I was a voice in the wilderness that warned them, and they responded to it, and they got saved. Very few. But Gaylord's way was a way of caring, right? And so that was him that day, and he argued with me, and I didn't. I was unhappy.
How long did that conversation last?
Probably 15 minutes,
Oh, wow.
maybe 20 minutes at the most. And then he saw I was getting frustrated, and he stopped it. And he said, look, I see that you're getting frustrated, and I have no intention of frustrating you. And maybe you haven't thought about these things that way before. And you really need to think about these things a little bit differently. So let me tell you what. Why don't you take this, right? And he handed me a couple of gospel tracts. And he said, these have a way of explaining it, but they're not perfect. So I'm here whenever you want to talk. And I was thinking to myself, good, this is where he wants my money. And he goes, you know what? Why don't you go back and have a donut? Sit down. And so I went back there, and this lady brings out this cake platter, big, on a stand, glass dome full of donuts. And she set it down and pulled the lid off. And she said, would you like some coffee? And I said, well, how much is it? She goes, oh, nothing here costs you anything. And I said, then yeah, I'd like some coffee. And I sat there eating donuts and coffee and feeling miserable about myself. Now I was more miserable than I'd ever been in my life. I was so miserable because these people were so nice and they really didn't want my money. And that was my goal of the day, right? And I'm tired, and I know at that moment that I'm the most miserable person on earth because I hate everybody. Even these people who are good and nice, I hate because I couldn't prove them wrong. And I was never the guy who just got in fights to get in fights. I was the guy who would make your life so miserable. I would mentally destroy you, and I would make other people hate you, and I'd work behind the scenes, and I'd destroy people's lives. I was that kind of hate. I was a long game hate kind of guy, and I was miserable. And the next day, we're going out on a long field trip. And I'm so learning disabled that in the morning when I wake up, I can't get anything right. So everything has to be preset for me in the morning. If I ever get dressed in the dark, you'll know it. And so I would take everything out of my pockets at night, put them in my new uniform, lock it away. And the next morning, I could just get up and put it on. I didn't have to think about anything. And those gospel tracts made it in my uniform, and they made it out to the field with me. And at the time, it's the Carter administration. So we don't have any fuel. We don't have any bullets. We don't have enough people to run a tank, right? It's me and a tank commander, and we drive out there, and we sit under a tree, and we talk. We draw pictures in the sand of the things we would do if we had things like guns and bullets, right? And gasoline to drive the tank around. And so I'm sitting on this tank for a day all by myself. He's off talking with the platoon leader and the commanders and all that kind of stuff. And I'm sitting in the cockpit of this tank. It's a beautiful 70-degree day in February in Texas. Absolutely perfect weather outside. And I am the most miserable, honorary person in the world. I hate myself. I hate the world. I don't like anybody. I don't like God. I'm mad about the whole thing. I don't like it. I'm this ball of misery and hatred, and I'm sitting in the cockpit of this tank, and I've read 9-2357, 2350-257-P, the parts manual for my tank. I've read the, I've read every idiot sticker and everything I can read. I'm looking for something to read, and I find one of those gospel tracts, and it's that one that you've seen before called God's Simple Way of Salvation. And I read that tract, and as I'm reading that tract, this weird mind that I have comes to this thought that says, if God were ever going to do anything to overcome all of my objections, I could not think of another way he could do it. He literally set aside all his power and glory, made himself like a man, had an unfair trial, an undeserving death for me. I didn't understand the resurrection. That was not even it. But the idea that he would do that and count that for all the other injustices that I saw made sense to me in a way nothing ever did. And I turned around in that little seat in the cockpit of the tank, and I said, okay, God, if you're really there, and I know I don't hear voices, and I didn't hear voices that day either, but I knew I had met his disapproval. It was like, no, there's some other people I might let get away with saying that, but no, you either believe it or you don't. You make up your mind. Like, okay, I believe you're there. And if you're willing, no, you either have to believe I'm willing to do this for you, or this is no deal. We're not making deals today. You understand? I'm done making deals with you. You're either going to take it as I give it, or you're going to leave it. Which one are you going to go for? I was like, I can't live like this anymore. I'm done. I'm at the end of everything. I hate myself. I need you to change something, or I can't. I'm dead. I want to kill myself. I need you to fix it. I want you to save me. Do you really believe I'm going to do this for you? I don't know how I'm going to know that. I didn't ask you that. I asked you if you could really believe it. Yes, I believe you're going to save me. I believe you will do it because this is the only thing that has ever made sense to me like this. You're going to do this thing. Okay. And he did. And I can't explain it to this day. I cannot tell you the difference that happened. All I know is that in that moment, all the anger vanished. The hatred washed away like I cannot explain to anybody. I can't tell
in
anybody.
that moment.
At that moment, in that
Wow.
one moment, what happened? There's nothing external that explains it. It's not like my mind was suddenly clean. It's not like, I just don't know how to explain that suddenly I didn't hate anything anymore, or anyone, or the world. That my whole perspective on everything changed in that moment. And when Paul says that thing, old things have passed away, behold, all things have become new. I see that verse differently than a lot of people see it. They're thinking of it as God's accounting system. But I'm telling you, it's not. It's a fundamental change in the creature, and that's what Paul's trying to say. He's not saying God accounts it all new, whether you feel it or not. He's saying, no, the truth is, you are no longer the creature that you were before. The whole creation has just changed. It's no longer the creation that it was. The whole creation was this natural creation that was there before, but it's not that creation anymore. And words can't ever seem to describe the change that happens. And I can't to this day. I can tell you, to this day, anger for me is like drugs would be for a drug addict. If I get angry about something, I'm immediately repulsed by it. I can never justify anger. I never find a justified anger. always wrong. I can never find a justified hatred. It is always wrong for me. Now you might say, Paul says, be angry and sin not. Yeah, but I think people take that out of context too, and they don't understand what he's saying there either. And he's not actually saying you have the right to be angry with anybody. That's just not right. And when I do, I'm wrong. And maybe that's not true for everybody,
But it's true for
but
you.
that's true for me.
It's like your analogy of a drug addict or an alcoholic.
Yep. It might be fine for other Christians to drink, but if you're an alcoholic and you got saved, it's not right for you to drink, and you know it's not. And every time you do it, the Lord convicts you of it, right? It's my conscience, and I'm telling you, I can't do that justifiably.
And so when that happened, then when did you go back to see Gaylord?
It was about 2 months. I was like afraid to. I was afraid of it being a cult, and I would get drug in. But the odd thing was, it was a Jewish man. About 2 months later, a guy named Herbie Roth, and Herbie said, I know this place that is really entertaining. You got to see this place. And of course, he's known me for, I don't know, 6 months to a year. And he knows me one way. And I have no way to talk to anybody about what happened to me. I didn't walk around saying, I got saved, my life has changed. I was like afraid to talk to anybody about anything. I walked around like I was stunned for probably a couple of months. And then Herbie says, I know this place. And I was like, okay, I'm up for some good entertainment. And he takes me to the Christian Servicemen Center. I was like, I know this place. I know this guy in here. And Herbie goes, really? You've been here before? I said, yeah. And he's looking at me like, that's weird, And so we went in there, and Gaylord wasn't there at the time, but Gene was there, and we walked in, and it was the same thing. Come on in. Don't recognize you guys. And, have a donut. it was and there's all these guys standing around playing ping pong and doing all this stuff. And I thought, I didn't know all this happened in here. The ping pong table's like right there. You stumble over it. There's two of them, and how do you miss the thing? But, you just don't think about it when you're there by yourself. And it's full of all these people, and they're having fun, and they're talking. And this guy walks up to me, and he says, hey, are you saved? And I looked at him and I thought, I think I am. And he goes, when did that happen? I said, about 2 months ago, after I came in here and talked to this really big guy. And he goes, welcome to the family. And then I never left that place. I was there practically every night after that. All the time I was at Fort Hood.
Wow.
Yeah. That was my testimony.
And then did they do discipling or anything with you, or what was their ministry like after that?
Jim had a different, unique way of discipling. He's since passed on. I found that out, I don't know, a couple months ago. I went searching for him on the internet and found that Jim had passed away. And Jim Rowlett. And I didn't know anything about going to church, right? So Jim was the first one to say, you need to go to church. You need to start learning the Bible. You need to go to church and learn the Bible. And I was like, I'm a Catholic. And he says, no, you were, but you need to go to church. And since you don't know where you're going, you need to come with me. So I said, okay. So I went with him to church, right? And then there was a time, his method of discipling was kind of rough. So like I went on a field trip, and then I didn't go to church for a time. I was just, you could say I was falling away, but it wasn't that I was falling away. It's that I was struggling with, there was a chaplain who was, I would think he was an atheist. He was trying to tell me why the Bible wasn't right. And, I didn't know much at the time. So I was struggling very hard, and I wasn't going to church. And all of a sudden one Sunday morning, there's this pounding on my door in the barracks. And it was like 7 a.m. I was like really mad. And I got up and threw the door open, and Jim hit me, tackle, not at the waist, at the chest, right? And he's not a tall guy. He's about your size, right? But he's like you. He's like muscly, and he like hit me, wham, landed me on the ground. He's sitting on top of me, kneeling on my shoulders. Where have you been? He's got his fist up. I was like, I've been around. He said, you haven't been around church. I was like, yeah, so what? He says, you're not falling back. Not on my watch. Get up and get dressed, or I'm knocking your teeth out. I was like, only your brother can tell you something like that, right? Only a brother can do that. I don't recommend that method of discipleship. But I needed it, and Jim knew it, and he got it right?
Wow.
So that was the method of discipleship. They also had something else they would do. They brought in their donors a couple of times a year, and they would have an all-day thing for their donors to see what the ministry was doing, right? They didn't want anybody donating who didn't know what was happening in the servicemen's ministry. So they would bring them in, they'd meet people. Well, they also wanted the servicemen to be able to tell them what their faith meant. So they had this time when you would be given a period of time, and it was somewhere between 3 and 7 minutes. And they wanted you to share something from the Bible in that 3 to 7 minutes. And Gene approached me and said, I'd like you to be one of our speakers on that day. And I said, well, I don't know. I mean, look at all these guys. They know so much more than I know about the Bible. I don't know anything, you know. I think you should pick somebody else. He said, no, I think it needs to be you. And I said, okay. So I stood up on that day, and I remember struggling for hours. I could not. And finally, I selected a passage, and I thought, I'm going to speak on this. And so I did, and as I was standing there speaking, it was one of those frozen in time moments, and it's still in my mind to this day. I was looking around at those people, and I was speaking, but I was also listening. And it was like, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm supposed to be doing this. And I have no idea what this is. I had no idea what it meant to be called to preach or anything like that at the time, right? I had no Christian speak. I didn't know the language. But I was standing there. I was essentially preaching, and I went way over time.
No.
To the surprise of no one here.
To the surprise of no one.
And Gene was just fine with it. He told me, if you go over time, I'll let you know. I was like, I'm not even going to make 3 minutes. I'm sure of it. Right. 15 minutes later, I was done. And he was sitting down, and he nodded like, very good, very good. And I sat down thinking, so what does this mean now? Right. And I went to him afterwards, and I said, so what was that all about? And he goes, what do you mean, what was that all about? I said, what I was doing there. He goes, you mean preaching? And I said, is that what that's called? He said, well, generally that's what we call it. And he said, you did a good job, did a fine job, in fact, better than I expected. And I said, so what does that mean? And he goes, oh, well, I'm not going to be part of that discussion. You're going to have that conversation with the Lord, you and him. You're going to have to battle that one out. That was the end of that discussion. And I did battle it out. And eventually I said, okay, I'm a preacher. That's what I am. And that was hard. That wasn't the path I thought.
Wow.
I was going to be a soldier.
So you were going to make the military your career.
I thought so at the time.
Uh-huh.
It became very evident shortly thereafter that was not going to work out very well. I had this little problem that I thought I should think. And the Army had a contrary opinion. They thought I should mindlessly obey. I thought there's a better way to do this, and they thought, do it our way. I remember standing on the side of a tank. We're trying to take this big air filter thing off the side of a tank. And they've got all these tools, and it's like supposed to be it's like a 7-hour job to remove this thing and change it. And I said, there's a better way to do this. And my platoon sergeant looked at me, and he said, I don't believe you. I said, yeah, but I got to get out of uniform for just a second, a little way. And he goes, show me. So I pulled off my belt, and I wove it through this thing, and I just went, and it undid all 4 connections all at once in about 10 seconds, right, with no wrenches. And it, boom, and then you could just pick the air cleaner up off of there, and you didn't have to take the panels off, and you didn't have to do any of that. And I put my belt back on. He said, "Don't ever tell anybody about that." I was like, "No, we need to revise the manual." He said, "Don't tell anybody about it." Then I went and told other people, and I got in trouble for it. So we're not going to get along.
So it worked out well for the gospel then.
It worked out well for the gospel, I guess. Yeah.
Well, that is very, very interesting.
And we're over
I'd
time
never.
now.
No, we're right at time. No,
Okay.
we're right at time. I'd never heard I've heard bits of your story, but never the full version, the full story. It's very moving. I appreciate it. We really appreciate you coming in.
Thank you.
It has been
I
a real
appreciate being
pleasure,
here.
this conversation. I've enjoyed it again.
Good.
I always like talking to you
Well, thank
very
you.
much. And so thank you for coming in.
Likewise.
This is our last show before we go on hiatus for a few weeks.
We close it out on you.
Oh, no. Look, you're supposed to close on a high note.
It is a high note.
It is a high note. It was a good one. Yeah, Nolan's going on vacation for a while, so we're going to have a hiatus. We'll be gone for a few weeks.
That's like saying you're going to shave a zit off your face for a little while or something like that. No, I
After I
understand.
just gave you a compliment.
Without him, without him running it, I don't know what we'd do.
No,
couldn't
I've
do
tried
that.
it. I tried it once myself doing the cameras, and nah, I'll wait. And so in a few weeks we'll be back.
Okay.
And we'll have Trinidad Noyola coming
Oh,
on.
this is going to be good.
Yeah, we'll be good.
Yeah.
So we'll have Trinity Noyola, who's one of the other elders of the Church of Freeborn, Elder Emeritus, and he's going to come on. He's got a tremendous amount of different experiences that I want to talk to him about.
Yeah.
And also how he got involved in the ministry and how he got saved. Very interesting.
I think we need to turn the tables one day, and we need to interview Nolan.
Nolan?
I'm not that interesting to interview.
Yeah, but I think I'm not that interesting.
I need more life experience, I think. I think it would be a very short interview with him.
Actually, I think I could find some. I think there's some very interesting.
One of these days when I go on vacation, you and Nolan, you can interview
Yeah,
Nolan.
me and Nolan will sit here and have a
There you go.
conversation, but we'll talk about you. That would not be good.
Excellent. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here, Mike. And
for
thank
having
you,
me.
Nolan, for all your hard work. We appreciate what you do.
Yep.
Well, at least I do because I don't watch the videos. So I don't know if the
That's
people who
the
watch the videos appreciate it, but I do.
We do.
And we will see you in a few weeks. Take care.
All right.